The fire settles into a steady glow, and the night feels older somehow. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds slowly and without urgency. Tonight, we drift into the full story of Atlantis. What truly happened, what quietly faded, and what remained long after the embers of memory cooled. Let the story move at its own pace, and if you feel like it, let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. If I pronounce any words wrong, please know that I'm trying my best. Now, picture Athens in the year 360 BCE, when the city still carries the architectural grandeur of its golden age, but the political confidence has begun to fade like paint on temple walls exposed to too many Mediterranean summers. The Parthenon stands on the Acropolis, its marble columns catching the afternoon light in ways that make the stone seem almost translucent. But the empire that built it has been humbled by Sparta and reduced to a shadow of its former reach. In this diminished Athens lives an elderly man named Plato, around 70 years old now, his beard gone completely white, and his hands marked by the kind of age spots that remind you of your own mortality. He walks slowly through the colonnade of his academy, the philosophical school he founded decades earlier, where young men gather to debate questions about justice, beauty, and the nature of reality itself. Plato has spent his life thinking about perfection, not the superficial kind, not the perfect haircut or the perfect dinner party, but the deep structural perfection of forms and ideas that exist somewhere beyond our messy physical world. He believes, or at least argues, that everything we experience is merely a shadow of some ideal version that exists in a realm of pure thought. The chair you're sitting in is just an imperfect copy of the idea of chair itself. The justice you see in courtrooms is a pale reflection of justice as it truly exists. This philosophical obsession with ideal forms has led Plato to imagine ideal societies, ideal governments, and ideal ways of organising human life to achieve something approaching perfection. His earlier work, The Republic, outlined a vision of a perfect city-state governed by philosopher kings who would rule with wisdom rather than ambition, where every citizen would be educated according to their abilities and positioned according to their talents. But ideas expressed as abstract philosophy can feel dry, like reading an instruction manual for living. So Plato, who understands how human minds actually work, often wraps his philosophy in stories. He creates myths and allegories that make his points more memorable than any logical argument could. He's already given us the allegory of the cave, where prisoners mistake shadows for reality. Now, in his old age, he's about to give us something even more enduring. The specific occasion for Plato's story about Atlantis comes during a series of philosophical dialogues he writes near the end of his life. These dialogues feature his old teacher Socrates, dead for decades now, executed by Athens for corrupting the youth with too many uncomfortable questions, along with other historical figures engaging in the kind of sophisticated dinner party conversation that ancient Greeks excelled at. In these dialogues titled Timaeus and Critias, Plato has one of his characters recount a story supposedly passed down through generations, originally told to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, by Egyptian priests during his travels 2 centuries earlier. It's a framing device that gives the story both ancient authority and convenient distance. Plato isn't claiming to have witnessed any of this himself, merely preserving knowledge supposedly handed down through time. The story emerges naturally from a philosophical discussion about ideal states and the nature of civilization. After outlining his vision of a perfect society, Plato has his characters wonder, has such a society ever actually existed? Could the abstract ideals he's been describing ever manifest in the physical world? And in answering this hypothetical question, Plato creates Atlantis. But before we dive into the story itself, it's worth considering what Athens must have felt like to an old philosopher watching his city struggle with its diminished status. The Persian Wars were ancient history now. The glory days of Pericles had faded into nostalgic memory, and Athens had lost its devastating conflict with Sparta. The city that had once dominated the Aegean through a combination of naval power, democratic ideals, and cultural sophistication was now just another Mediterranean city-state. Important, but no longer exceptional. In this context, Plato's mind might naturally turn to questions about rise and fall, about whether greatness can be sustained or whether it contains the seeds of its own destruction. These weren't abstract philosophical questions for him. They were observations about his own society's trajectory. Athens had been great and was now diminished. What lessons could be drawn from that experience? The Mediterranean world that Plato inhabits is one where the sea connects rather than divides. From his vantage point in Athens, you can see how maritime trade creates webs of connection, linking cities around the entire Mediterranean basin. Ships carry not just cargo, but also ideas, stories, and news of distant places. Sailors return from voyages with tales of strange lands, unusual customs, and cities that excel in different arts than Athens does. This maritime consciousness, this awareness of a world much larger than one's own city, permeates Greek thinking in ways that might not be immediately obvious to us. When Plato imagines Atlantis, he places it in the ocean, specifically beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the vast Atlantic that Greeks regarded with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. The Mediterranean was their pond. The Atlantic was something more mysterious, a realm of possibility where anything might exist. Plato himself probably never travelled far by sea. His voyages to Sicily to advise the tyrant of Syracuse were about as adventurous as he got, and those trips were motivated by his hope of implementing philosophical governance in a real city rather than any desire for maritime adventure. But like most educated Greeks, he would have absorbed countless stories from travellers, traders, and returning sailors about distant lands and unusual peoples. The physical experience of being by the sea in ancient Greece would have been quite different from our modern beach vacations. The Mediterranean isn't the gentle, tourist-friendly body of water it often appears to be in contemporary photographs. It can turn violent with stunning speed, transforming from glassy calm to white-capped fury in the time it takes to finish a meal. Greek sailors respected and feared the sea in equal measure, seeing it as a realm where human control was always provisional and nature's power absolute. This relationship with maritime unpredictability would have influenced how Greeks thought about civilization itself. Cities could rise and fall as quickly as storms could appear. Trading networks that seemed permanent could be disrupted by piracy, war, or shifts in political power. The sea connected people, but also reminded them of their vulnerability. An island civilization, however powerful, would always be subject to forces beyond its control. Plato's decision to set his imaginary civilization on an island, then, isn't arbitrary. Islands are naturally bounded, finite spaces where social organization can be imagined in its complete form. They're also inherently fragile, dependent on maritime connections for survival, and vulnerable to naval attack or natural disaster. An island civilization is a perfect setting for exploring questions about the sustainability of power and the relationship between human ambition and natural limits. As you drift deeper towards sleep, imagine yourself in Plato's position. An elderly thinker reflecting on your life's work, on the society that raised you, and on the gap between ideal visions and actual human behavior. What story would you tell to capture everything you've learned about how civilizations succeed and fail? What details would you include to make your philosophical points feel real, lived, and experienced rather than merely theorized? This is the mindset from which Atlantis emerges, not as historical reporting, but as philosophical teaching clothed in narrative form, designed to make abstract ideas concrete and memorable. Plato is about to create a story so vivid, so detailed, so convincing that people will still be looking for Atlantis more than 2 millennia after he writes it. Despite his never claiming it was anything more than an illustrative tale, the Atlantis that Plato describes emerges in layers, like a painting being completed detail by careful detail, each brushstroke adding depth to the overall vision. He doesn't simply announce that a great civilization once existed. He builds it before your mind's eye with the kind of specificity that makes imagination feel like memory. Begin with the geography, because that's where Plato starts. Atlantis sits in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, positioned where no Greek ship would venture in Plato's time. The island itself is larger than Libya and Asia combined, which in Greek geographical understanding means it's absolutely massive, a continental landmass rather than a mere island. Already, Plato is signalling that this is a story operating on a grand scale, dealing with a civilization whose physical size matches its cultural ambitions. The island's landscape features a large coastal plain, rectangular in shape and surrounded by mountains that shelter it from northern winds. These mountains aren't barren rock faces, but are rich with forests, villages, and streams that feed the plain below. The plain itself measures about 330 by 220 miles. Plato gives precise measurements, the kind of specificity that lends credibility to the description. And through this plain, engineers have cut a channel connecting the coast to a circular series of waterways at the centre of the island. At the island's heart sits the capital city, and here Plato's description becomes almost architectural in its precision. Picture concentric circles of alternating water and land, like a target pattern visible from above. The central island measures about 5 stadia in diameter, roughly half a mile, and on this elevated centre sit the royal palace and the temples of Poseidon and Clito, the divine and mortal ancestors of the Atlantean royal line. Surrounding this central island are alternating rings of water and land, each precisely measured. The rings of water serve as both defensive moats and transportation channels, connected by tunnels large enough to allow ships to pass from the outer ocean through to the innermost harbour. The rings of land feature walls covered in precious metals, brass on the outer wall, tin on the middle wall, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum on the innermost wall, which glows with a ruddy light like fire. This is the part where Plato's imagination for detail becomes almost overwhelming. He describes bridges connecting the land rings, underground passages allowing ships to move between the circular harbours, and a sophisticated system of docks and naval facilities that would make even our modern port planners envious. The engineering required to create such a city would be staggering. Excavating millions of tons of earth, constructing massive retaining walls, managing water flow between the circular channels, and maintaining the structural integrity of an entire artificial landscape. But Plato isn't finished with his architectural vision. He describes the temples in detail that suggests he's thought deeply about what buildings in an ideal civilization would look like. The Temple of Poseidon features a roof adorned with ivory, walls plated with silver, and a golden statue of the sea god standing in a chariot pulled by winged horses, so tall it touches the temple's ceiling. Around the temple are golden statues of the original 10 kings of Atlantis and their wives, along with many other offerings that speak to the wealth and piety of Atlantean society. The city includes hot and cold springs, convenient for bathing, which Greeks considered essential to civilized life, along with elaborate bathhouses for common citizens and separate facilities for royalty. There are gymnasia for athletic training, racecourses for horses, and gardens that suggest Atlanteans appreciated beauty as much as functionality. The attention to public amenities indicates a civilization that valued its citizens' well-being and understood that great societies require more than military might. Moving beyond the central city, Plato describes the broader island with equal attention to detail. The rectangular plain is divided into 60,000 sections, each measuring about 10 stadia square, and each section is responsible for providing one military unit to the kingdom's defence forces. This level of administrative organisation, keeping track of thousands of districts, managing their contributions, coordinating their military obligations, suggests a bureaucratic sophistication that rivals any ancient empire. The plain's fertility is legendary in Plato's telling. It produces 2 harvests annually, watered by winter rains and summer irrigation, from streams flowing down from the mountains. The irrigation system itself is a marvel of engineering, a network of channels cutting across the plain at regular intervals, allowing water to be distributed wherever crops need it. Any farmer reading Plato's description would recognize the kind of coordinated labor and long-term planning such a system would require. Beyond agriculture, Atlantis excels in every form of production and craft. The mountains provide timber for shipbuilding, not just ordinary wood, but varieties suited to different purposes, chosen by skilled foresters who understand their materials. Mines yield precious metals in such abundance that orichalcum, which Plato describes as second only to gold in value, can be used as decorative plating on walls and buildings. Craftsmen work in every medium: stone, metal, wood, textiles, producing goods that blend utility with beauty. The island's fauna includes everything from domestic animals to elephants, which Plato specifically mentions to emphasize the island's extraordinary diversity and richness. This detail always strikes readers as either charmingly naive or brilliantly strategic, depending on whether they think Plato believed elephants actually lived in the Atlantic, or was intentionally including an exotic detail to underscore how different this civilization was from anything in the Greek world. Plato also describes the Atlantean diet with the kind of attention that suggests he's thought about what an ideal society would eat. They have fruits and grains, roots and herbs, wine and oils, everything necessary not just for survival, but for the kind of sophisticated cuisine that Greeks associated with civilized living. The mention of specific agricultural products grounds the story in physical reality, making Atlantis feel like a place where actual people lived actual lives, rather than an abstract philosophical construct. The political organization of Atlantis reflects Plato's philosophical interests while avoiding the kind of rigid structure he proposed in the Republic. 10 kings rule the island, each descended from one of Poseidon's sons by the mortal woman Cleito. These kings govern their own territories but meet regularly to make decisions affecting the entire civilization. Their laws are inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the Temple of Poseidon, and before making any significant decision, the kings perform an elaborate ritual involving the sacrifice of a bull, chosen without weapons, implying some sort of consensual selection that hints at the king's divine connection. This political structure is interesting because it combines monarchy with something like federalism, recognizing that large territories might be better governed by distributed authority than by a single centralized power. The regular meetings of the kings suggest Plato imagines Atlantis as having developed sophisticated protocols for collective decision-making, ways of balancing different regional interests while maintaining overall unity. The military organization receives detailed attention as well. Each of the 60,000 districts on the plain provides specific military resources: infantry, cavalry, chariots, sailors, creating an army and navy of enormous size. Plato calculates the total military strength with mathematical precision, giving exact numbers for different types of units. The navy alone requires 200 ships, each crewed by trained sailors, suggesting both the maritime focus of Atlantean civilization and the logistical complexity of maintaining such a force. But perhaps most revealing is what Plato says about Atlantean culture and values. For many generations, he tells us, the Atlanteans remained true to their divine ancestry, valuing wisdom over wealth and treating their prosperity as a trust to be managed rather than a resource to be exploited. They lived according to laws that prioritized justice and collective well-being over individual gain. This golden age of Atlantean civilization represented the ideal society made manifest. Not perfect, because perfection doesn't exist in the physical world, but as close to the ideal forms as human civilization might actually achieve. The physical details Plato provides, the precise measurements, the specific materials, the calculated military strengths, all serve a philosophical purpose. They make Atlantis feel real enough to believe in while demonstrating what a civilization organized around right principles might actually accomplish. The engineering marvels show what becomes possible when human intelligence is directed toward collective flourishing, rather than individual aggrandizement. The administrative sophistication demonstrates what justice looks like when implemented through practical governance rather than abstract theorizing. As you let these images settle into your mind like sediment drifting down through water, Notice how Plato's Atlantis combines grandeur with human scale. Yes, the city is massive and the civilization is powerful, but it's also a place where people bathe in public baths, exercise in gymnasia, grow crops, and gather in temples. It's not an alien world, but a human one, just organised according to better principles than the Greeks managed in their actual cities. This is the world Plato imagined. Wealthy but not decadent, powerful but not tyrannical, sophisticated but not corrupt, at least not yet. Because the story of Atlantis isn't ultimately about sustained perfection, but about the impossibility of maintaining it. The transformation of Atlantis from ideal civilization to cautionary tale happens gradually in Plato's telling, like watching fruit ripen and then spoil in slow motion. This isn't a dramatic collapse triggered by a single catastrophic event, at least not initially. Instead, it's a quiet deterioration of character that eventually calls down disaster as its natural consequence. Plato describes how, over many generations, the divine element in Atlantean nature became diluted, mixed repeatedly with mortal characteristics through generations of reproduction. The divine spark that had made the original Atlanteans wise and temperate grew fainter and fainter, like a signal degrading as it travels further from its source. This isn't about genetics in the modern sense, but about spiritual and moral inheritance. The idea that excellence of character must be actively maintained or it inevitably declines. The visible symptoms of this moral deterioration appear first in changing attitude toward wealth and power. Where earlier generations of Atlanteans had viewed their prosperity as a sacred trust, later generations began treating it as personal property to be enjoyed, displayed, and expanded. The metals that once plated walls as offerings to gods became symbols of personal status. The agricultural abundance that had fed everyone well became a means of accumulating surplus wealth that could be converted into political influence. You can imagine how this transformation might have felt to an observant Atlantean living through it, like watching your neighbourhood slowly change character as different priorities take hold. The old families who remembered the traditional values would notice first. Younger generations seemed less interested in maintaining the temples and more focused on expanding their personal estates. Conversations at public baths gradually shifted from philosophical discussions to comparisons of wealth and achievement. The gymnasia, once places where citizens developed their bodies as temples of divine spirit, became venues for competitive display. Military ambition provides another symptom of Atlantean decline. The navy and army that had been maintained for defensive purposes and to ensure justice within their sphere of influence began to be seen as tools for expansion and conquest. Plato describes how Atlanteans began subjugating other peoples, extending their control beyond their island to coastal territories around the Mediterranean. They conquered Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, essentially dominating the entire western Mediterranean basin. This imperial expansion represents more than just territorial ambition. It signals a fundamental shift in Atlantean self-understanding. Instead of seeing themselves as stewards of an ideal society that might inspire others through its example, they began viewing their civilization as superior in ways that justified dominating inferior peoples. The philosophical commitment to justice became subordinated to the practical exercise of power. Might began to make right in ways that would have horrified earlier generations of Atlantean thinkers. The specific trigger for Atlantis' ultimate destruction comes when they decide to attack Athens, or rather, an ancient Athens that existed 9,000 years before Plato's time, back when the Mediterranean world was supposedly very different from the one he inhabits. This detail is important because it connects Plato's Atlantis story to Athenian glory, making Athens the city that stood against Atlantean imperialism and won. Plato's account of this conflict is brief and somewhat frustrating for anyone hoping for detailed battle descriptions. He tells us that Athens, despite being smaller and less wealthy than Atlantis, successfully resisted the Atlantean invasion through a combination of courage, superior political organization, and commitment to justice. The Athenians embodied the virtues that Atlanteans had lost. They fought not for conquest, but for freedom, not to dominate, but to preserve their way of life. This reversal is philosophically significant. It demonstrates that moral excellence provides advantages that material power cannot overcome, that a just city organized around right principles can defeat a wealthier, larger, more technologically advanced opponent if that opponent has lost touch with the virtues that originally made it great. It's Plato's way of suggesting that Athens in his own time might yet recover greatness, if it returns to the values that made it exceptional during its golden age. But the military defeat isn't the end of Atlantis. That comes from nature itself, from forces so much more powerful than human armies that military might becomes irrelevant. After the conflict with Athens, Plato tells us, there came a single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods. The entire Atlantean civilization disappeared beneath the waves, swallowed by the ocean that had once been its highway for trade and conquest. The destruction is complete and total. The circular harbours that had taken generations to construct fill with seawater and sediment. The palace walls plated with precious metals sink beyond human reach. The temples where bulls had been sacrificed and laws solemnly proclaimed collapse under waves that recognise no human authority. The agricultural plain with its sophisticated irrigation channels becomes an underwater landscape where fish swim over what were once fields of grain. Plato emphasises that after Atlantis sank, the ocean in that region became unnavigable, full of mud and shallow waters that made passage impossible. This detail serves multiple purposes. It explains why no one in Plato's time can find physical evidence of Atlantis. It's buried under oceanic silt in an area ships cannot reach. It also suggests that some transgressions against natural order leave permanent scars on the landscape itself, that the destruction of Atlantis wasn't just punishment, but a kind of cosmic editing that removed the civilization so completely it left only traces too faint to follow. The gentle, almost quiet way Plato describes this catastrophe makes it more rather than less unsettling. There's no dramatic final battle, no heroic last stand, and no opportunity for redemption through courageous resistance. The earthquakes and floods simply come, indifferent to Atlantean achievements, wealth, or power. Nature reasserts its primacy over human pretensions, with a finality that leaves no room for appeals or second chances. What makes this ending particularly poignant is that it comes just when Atlantis has reached peak power. The empire is at its largest extent, its military at maximum strength, its wealth seemingly unlimited. From a purely material standpoint, Atlantis has never been more successful. But success measured in conventional terms, territory, wealth, power, has become decoupled from the virtues that originally justified and sustained that success. The catastrophe functions in Plato's story as what we might now call a systems correction. When civilizations grow powerful enough to dominate their regional environment, they sometimes forget they remain embedded in larger natural systems that don't care about human hierarchies or ambitions. Atlantis' disappearance beneath the waves is Plato's way of saying that no civilization, however advanced or powerful, can indefinitely violate the principles that make flourishing possible without eventually facing consequences. As you let this image settle, an entire civilization slipping beneath dark waters, its rings of harbours filling with the ocean that once brought it wealth, its temples and palaces becoming homes for fish and seaweed, notice how Plato has transformed a philosophical argument into something visceral and memorable. Abstract points about the relationship between virtue and sustainability become the story of an island empire that literally sinks under the weight of its own moral failure. The fall of Atlantis happens both suddenly and slowly. Suddenly in the sense that the final destruction comes in a day and night. Slowly in that the moral deterioration that makes destruction inevitable unfolds across generations. This double temporality reflects how civilizational collapse actually works. The underlying causes accumulate gradually, often invisibly, until some triggering event reveals how fragile the whole structure has become. Plato never explicitly moralizes about Atlantis' destruction. He doesn't need to. The story itself carries the philosophical weight, demonstrating how prosperity without wisdom, power without justice, and expansion without limits eventually call down disaster. The sinking of Atlantis into the ocean becomes a physical metaphor for what happens when civilizations sink into moral confusion. They disappear beneath forces they once thought they controlled, leaving only stories to mark where they stood. Now that the story has been told, the rise imagined and the fall described, we can step back and consider what Plato was actually doing when he created Atlantis. Because this was never meant to be history in the sense we usually understand it. It was philosophy dressed in narrative clothing, ideas given form through fictional geography and imaginary catastrophe. The first thing to understand is that Plato's audience would have approached this story very differently than we do. Modern readers encounter Atlantis as an ancient mystery, wondering whether such a place ever existed and searching for archaeological evidence that might confirm or disprove the account. Ancient Greeks would have recognized immediately that Plato was doing what he always did, using story to make philosophical arguments more vivid and memorable than abstract reasoning alone could achieve. Think about how Plato typically argues in his dialogues. He rarely makes straightforward statements about truth or virtue. Instead, he constructs elaborate thought experiments, extended analogies, and hypothetical scenarios that let readers discover principles for themselves through imaginative engagement. The allegory of the cave doesn't work because prisoners were actually chained in a cave watching shadows. It works because the scenario illuminates something true about knowledge and perception. Atlantis operates the same way. The philosophical content embedded in the Atlantis story concerns several of Plato's most persistent preoccupations. First, there's the question of whether ideal societies can exist in the physical world, or whether perfection remains eternally limited to the realm of forms. By creating Atlantis as a nearly ideal society that existed but didn't last, Plato suggests that excellence is achievable but not sustainable, that human civilizations can approach the ideal but cannot permanently embody it. This connects to a deeper pessimism about material existence that runs throughout Plato's mature philosophy. The physical world, in his view, is always corrupted by change, decay, and the contamination of matter. Pure ideas exist eternally and unchangingly in some transcendent realm, but when those ideas take physical form, they become subject to time and deterioration. Atlantis embodies this principle. Even divine wisdom dilutes across generations as the physical aspects of human nature dominate the spiritual ones. Second, the Atlantis story illustrates the relationship between virtue and political success. Plato has been arguing throughout his career that justice isn't just ethically right, but practically effective, that cities organized around wisdom and justice will flourish while those governed by ambition and corruption will fail. Atlantis provides a case study demonstrating this principle across multiple generations, showing both how virtue creates flourishing and how vice leads to destruction. The timing of Atlantis' fall is significant here. They're destroyed not while weak and corrupt, but at the peak of their imperial power, just after conquering much of the Mediterranean. This suggests that visible success, measured in conventional terms like wealth, territory, and military strength, can mask underlying moral bankruptcy. A civilization can appear strong precisely when it's most vulnerable, because the very strength it displays comes from having abandoned the principles that would make that strength sustainable. Third, Plato uses Atlantis to explore the relationship between human ambition and natural limits. The engineering marvels of Atlantean civilization, the circular harbours, the irrigation systems, the massive architectural works, demonstrate human capacity to reshape the physical world according to rational plans. But the final destruction by earthquake and flood reminds us that human power remains limited, that nature ultimately constrains what civilizations can achieve no matter how sophisticated their technology becomes. This isn't anti-technology or anti-progress in some simple sense. Plato clearly admires Atlantean engineering and sees the practical application of geometric and mathematical knowledge as properly human. But he's also insisting that technical capacity must be balanced by wisdom about appropriate ends and moral constraints on how power should be used. Technology without wisdom leads to the kind of imperial overreach that calls down disaster. The comparison between Atlantis and ancient Athens serves additional philosophical purposes. Athens in Plato's story is smaller, less wealthy, and technologically less advanced than Atlantis, yet it successfully defends itself and represents the more genuinely just society. This reverses the usual assumption that bigger and richer means better, suggesting that quality of political organisation and moral character matter more than quantity of resources. For Plato's contemporary audience in 4th century Athens, this comparison would have carried particular resonance. Athens had lost its empire, been humiliated by Sparta, and seemed to be declining from its golden age. Plato's story offers both consolation and challenge. Consolation in suggesting that Athens once embodied the virtues that defeated a more powerful foe, and challenge in asking whether contemporary Athens still maintains those virtues, or has become more like Atlantis in its decline. The warning embedded in the Atlantis story is subtle but clear. Imperial success can corrupt the virtues that made success possible in the first place. Athens had built an empire based on naval power, cultural achievement, and democratic ideals, but maintaining the empire required increasingly aggressive tactics, extraction of wealth from subject cities, and political manoeuvring that compromised those original ideals. Was Athens becoming Atlantis? Would prosperity and power lead to moral decay and eventual catastrophe? Plato never makes this parallel explicit, but he didn't need to. His readers would have recognized the pattern. The Atlantis story functions as a mirror in which Athenians might recognize uncomfortable truths about their own civilization's trajectory. The luxury to see this mirror clearly, to consider whether wealth and power were corrupting civic virtue, was itself possible only because Athens had lost enough power to force reflection on what had been lost and why. The choice to set Atlantis in the distant past, 9,000 years before Plato's time, rather than presenting it as a contemporary civilization, creates useful distance. By pushing the story back into mythical time, before recorded history, Plato frees himself from the constraints of historical accuracy, while also suggesting that the patterns he's describing are timeless. Civilizations have always faced these same tensions between virtue and corruption, wisdom and ambition, and sustainable flourishing and overreaching destruction. The detail about Atlantis' location beyond the Pillars of Hercules serves similar purposes. Placing the lost civilization in the vast Atlantic rather than the familiar Mediterranean locates it in a realm of possibility rather than historical fact. The Atlantic represented the unknown, the area where mythical geography blended into pure speculation. Putting Atlantis there signals that this is a story operating in symbolic rather than literal geography, using physical space to represent philosophical concepts. Finally, there's something to notice about what Plato doesn't say. He never claims to have visited Atlantis or spoken with survivors. He attributes the story to ancient tradition passed through multiple generations of retellings, with each layer of transmission providing plausible deniability. This framing allows him to present detailed descriptions without claiming historical authority, to create vivid world-building while maintaining that he's merely preserving an old tale. This narrative strategy accomplishes two things simultaneously. It makes the story more believable by giving it the patina of ancient tradition, while also protecting Plato from being called a liar if anyone questions the account's historicity. He can always retreat to, "This is what I was told. These are the traditions I'm preserving." The story's truth value lies in its philosophical insights rather than its historical accuracy, a distinction that ancient audiences understood better than many modern readers do. As you rest with these layers of meaning, notice how a story that seems simple on the surface, a great civilization exists, becomes corrupt, and gets destroyed, actually carries philosophical arguments about knowledge, virtue, power, sustainability, and the relationship between human ambition and natural limits. Plato has created something rare, a myth that functions simultaneously as entertainment, moral instruction, political warning, and metaphysical speculation. The meaning behind the myth isn't singular but multiple, shifting depending on which aspects you focus on and what questions you bring to the story. This richness of interpretation isn't a bug but a feature. It's why Atlantis has remained compelling across cultures and centuries, why each generation finds something relevant in the tale of the island empire that sank beneath the waves. The moment Plato finished writing about Atlantis, or perhaps even before he completed the account, people began wondering whether the story was true. Not true in the philosophical sense. Everyone recognized Plato was making arguments about ideal societies and moral decay, but true in the historical sense. Had such a civilization actually existed? This question has generated an industry of speculation, exploration, and occasionally outright fantasy that spans more than 2 millennia. The search for Atlantis says as much about the searchers and their historical moments as it does about Plato's original story. Each era has looked for Atlantis in ways that reflect its own preoccupations, technologies, and assumptions about what lost civilizations might teach us. Plato's immediate successors approached the story with appropriate skepticism. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, apparently thought his teacher had invented Atlantis entirely, creating it merely to serve philosophical purposes and then destroying it just as conveniently. This reading suggests that educated Greeks in the generation after Plato understood his methodology, using fictional scenarios to illustrate philosophical principles, wasn't considered dishonest, but pedagogically effective. However, other ancient writers took the account more literally. Some tried to rationalize elements of the story, suggesting that Plato had exaggerated details, but preserved memories of some actual Bronze Age civilization that had been destroyed by natural disaster. Others attempted to identify Atlantis with known places. Perhaps it was Crete, which had been devastated by volcanic eruption and tsunami when Thera exploded around 1600 BCE, destroying the Minoan civilization. The Crete theory emerged because ancient writers recognized patterns in Plato's description that matched what they knew about Minoan culture. The emphasis on naval power, the sophisticated architecture, and the central role of bull worship, all these elements characterized Minoan civilization as Greeks, understood it from ruins and lingering cultural memories. Perhaps Plato or his sources had preserved garbled accounts of Minoan glory and its sudden destruction, with details becoming exaggerated through centuries of retelling. But the chronology presented problems. Plato specifically placed Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would be roughly 9,600 BCE if we take the numbers literally. This predates any known civilization with the kind of architectural and engineering sophistication Plato describes. Some ancient interpreters suggested that Plato or his Egyptian sources had confused years with months, or used some alternative calendrical system, but this requires assuming fundamental numerical errors in a story that's otherwise remarkably precise about measurements and quantities. As classical civilization transitioned into late antiquity, and then the medieval period, interest in Atlantis waned. Christian scholars who inherited Greek learning were more interested in reconciling pagan philosophy with biblical truth than in pursuing stories about sunken islands. If Atlantis appeared in medieval texts at all, it was usually as a minor curiosity or as an allegory that could be reinterpreted in Christian terms. The Renaissance brought renewed fascination with classical texts and the world beyond Europe. As explorers discovered the Americas, some theorists suggested that these continents might be remnants of Atlantis, or that Atlantean survivors had established civilizations in the New World. This speculation mixed genuine puzzlement about how complex societies like the Aztecs and Incas developed with racist assumptions that indigenous peoples couldn't have achieved such sophistication without outside influence. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published in 1627, reimagined Plato's story as a utopian vision located somewhere in the Pacific. Bacon wasn't claiming historical accuracy, but rather using Atlantis as a framework for describing an ideal scientific society, much as Plato had used it to explore questions about virtue and governance. The name had become a kind of shorthand for imagined perfect society, its specifics less important than its function as a thought experiment. The 19th century brought more systematic attempts to locate Atlantis geographically. This reflected the era's confidence in the scientific method and its belief that mysteries could be solved through careful investigation and rational analysis. Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and amateur archaeologist, published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882, arguing that Atlantis had really existed in the Atlantic and that it explained various cultural similarities between Old and New World civilizations. Donnelly's book was enormously popular, going through dozens of printings and establishing many tropes that still dominate popular Atlantis theories. He argued that Atlantean refugees had spread to both sides of the Atlantic after their homeland sank, bringing advanced knowledge that jump-started Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Central American civilizations. Every pyramid, every flood myth, and every seemingly inexplicable technological achievement became potential evidence of Atlantean influence. The theory was creative but required ignoring actual chronology and archaeological evidence. Egyptian civilization developed gradually over millennia, with each advance building on previous work in ways that archaeologists can trace through physical remains. The same goes for Mesopotamian, Chinese, Indus Valley, and Mesoamerican civilizations. They all show clear developmental sequences rather than sudden acquisition of advanced knowledge from outside. But Donnelly's imaginative approach to evidence established a pattern that subsequent Atlantis hunters would follow. Start with Plato's account, selectively incorporate details that fit your preferred location, ignore contradictions, and interpret any ancient achievement that seems impressive as possible Atlantean influence. This methodology produces exciting narratives but terrible history. The 20th century brought even more exotic Atlantis theories, often disconnected from Plato's original account. Some esoteric movements positioned Atlantis as the homeland of ancient spiritual wisdom, describing it as having possessed technology and consciousness that modern humans have lost. Helena Blavatsky's Theosophical Society gave Atlantis a central role in its elaborate mythology about human spiritual evolution, describing multiple Atlantean races and civilizations spanning millions of years. These mystical interpretations transformed Atlantis from a philosophical thought experiment into something like a religious revelation, positioning it as the source of all ancient wisdom and the key to human spiritual advancement. Plato would probably have been bemused by this development. His story was meant to illustrate how civilizations fall when they abandon wisdom, not to suggest that some lost civilization possessed secret knowledge we should recover. The development of modern archaeology and oceanography should have settled questions about Atlantis' historical existence, but instead it just spawned new theories. When scientists discovered the mid-Atlantic ridge, some enthusiasts suggested this underwater mountain range might be the remnant of a sunken continent. The fact that the geology doesn't support this interpretation, the ridge is spreading apart, not sinking, and has been underwater for millions of years, did little to discourage speculation. Each new archaeological discovery in the Mediterranean region sparked fresh claims that the real Atlantis had been found. The island of Santorini, with its spectacular volcanic caldera and evidence of Bronze Age civilization buried under volcanic ash, became a favourite candidate. The Minoan settlement of Akrotiri, preserved like Pompeii under layers of pumice, showed sophisticated architecture, vibrant frescoes, and an advanced urban culture, everything one might expect from a civilization like Atlantis. The Santorini theory has several advantages. The volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunamis around 1600 BCE did destroy a powerful maritime civilization. The Minoans were indeed culturally advanced and influential throughout the Aegean. The geographical details, an island with a wealthy city destroyed by a volcanic catastrophe, match key elements of Plato's account. You can visit the ruins today and see what an Atlantis-like civilization actually looked like. The main problem, of course, is that Santorini is in the wrong ocean, at the wrong time and on the wrong scale. Plato specified the Atlantic beyond Gibraltar, not the Aegean. He dated Atlantis to 9600 BCE, not 1600 BCE. He described an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, not a modest Mediterranean island. Identifying Santorini as Atlantis requires dismissing most of Plato's specific details as errors or exaggerations. Other proposed Atlantis locations include off the coast of Spain near the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Black Sea, before post-Ice Age sea level rise flooded that region, in Antarctica, based on fringe theories about ancient maps showing ice-free coastlines, and even in the Bahamas, where underwater rock formations sometimes create patterns that enthusiastic interpreters read as evidence of ancient roads or buildings. Each theory follows similar logic. Identify some archaeological site or geographical feature that vaguely matches some element of Plato's description. Interpret everything supporting this identification as evidence, dismiss contradictions as copyist errors or exaggerations, and present the result as finally solving the Atlantis mystery. Repeat as needed whenever a new underwater formation or ancient ruin is discovered. The persistence of Atlantis hunting, despite the complete lack of confirming evidence, tells us something important about human psychology. We want to believe in lost golden ages, in ancient wisdom that modern civilization has forgotten, and in mysteries that might still be solved if we just look in the right place. Atlantis serves these emotional needs regardless of whether it ever existed historically. Modern scholars generally agree that Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical device, and that searching for historical Atlantis makes no more sense than searching for the actual cave in his allegory of the cave. The story's power comes from its symbolic and philosophical content, not from historical accuracy. But this scholarly consensus has done little to dampen popular fascination with finding the lost continent. The search for Atlantis has generated countless books, documentaries, expeditions and debates. It has inspired serious archaeological work, researchers investigating whether memories of Bronze Age catastrophes might have influenced Greek mythology, and complete nonsense, theories involving aliens, crystals and psychic powers. The line between legitimate historical inquiry and imaginative speculation becomes blurry when dealing with something that probably never existed. What's interesting is how the search itself has changed over time, reflecting developments in technology and methodology. Early searchers relied on textual analysis and geographical speculation. 19th century investigators added archaeological comparisons and geological theories. Modern hunters use sonar mapping, satellite imagery, and computer analysis of ancient texts. Each era brings its most advanced tools to the search, finding in Atlantis whatever those tools are capable of revealing. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Atlantis exists precisely where Plato put it, in a philosophical dialogue designed to make arguments about virtue, power, and civilizational sustainability. The geographical Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules was always metaphorical, a location in possibility space rather than physical geography. Looking for it with sonar and submarines makes sense only if we've fundamentally misunderstood what kind of story Plato was telling. As you drift deeper towards sleep, consider that sometimes the most important truths are found not by discovering new facts, but by understanding more deeply what we already know. The search for Atlantis across ocean floors and ancient ruins might be less productive than reflecting on what Plato's story teaches about the relationship between virtue and sustainability, between wisdom and power, and between human ambition and natural limits. These lessons don't require archaeological confirmation. They require only thoughtful attention to the world we actually inhabit. The physical search for Atlantis has produced mostly disappointment, but the mental Atlantis, the one that exists in imagination, art, and cultural mythology, has proven remarkably fertile and enduring. This imaginary Atlantis tells us less about ancient history than about how different eras have understood perfection, loss, and the relationship between past and present. In literature, Atlantis has inspired countless retellings, each adapting Plato's basic framework to explore contemporary concerns. Jules Verne sent Captain Nemo to explore underwater Atlantean ruins in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, using the lost civilization as a symbol of humanity's accumulated knowledge lying just beyond reach beneath the waves. His Atlantis represented the 19th century's fascination with archaeological discovery and the technological capacity to reach previously inaccessible places. Science fiction writers have been particularly drawn to Atlantis, reimagining it as an advanced technological society whose achievements were only now beginning to match or surpass. These stories often position Atlantis as a civilization that developed differently from ours, perhaps emphasizing different technologies or organizing society around different principles, and ask what we might learn from studying an alternative path of development. Fantasy literature tends to treat Atlantis more mystically, as a civilization that mastered magic or spiritual practices that modern humanity has forgotten. These versions often suggest that material progress has come at the cost of spiritual wisdom, that something important was lost when rational scientific thinking displaced older, more intuitive ways of understanding the world. Atlantis becomes a symbol of this hypothetical lost knowledge, representing what we gave up to gain what we have. The tension in these imaginative treatments is always between two competing visions of the past. One sees history as progress. We're better off now than people were then, with more knowledge, better technology, and more humane values. The other sees history as a decline from an earlier, wiser age when people understood things we've forgotten. Atlantis can represent either vision depending on how the story is framed. Children's media has particularly embraced Atlantis as a setting for adventure and wonder. Animated films depict it as a colourful underwater kingdom full of exotic architecture and strange technology, a place where anything seems possible because it's freed from mundane historical constraints. These versions rarely engage with Plato's philosophical concerns about virtue and corruption, focusing instead on the sheer imaginative pleasure of a lost world waiting to be discovered. The Disney animated film Atlantis: The Lost Empire offers a good example of how modern retellings work. It keeps Plato's basic premise, ancient advanced civilization, circular architecture, powerful technology, while adding elements from later speculation and wholesale invention. The result is visually spectacular and narratively engaging, while having almost nothing to do with Plato's actual story. This is Atlantis as pure creative inspiration rather than historical or philosophical inquiry. Video games have found Atlantis useful as a setting that requires no explanation. Players accept that such a place might have existed because it's so culturally familiar, allowing game designers to create elaborate underwater or ancient civilizations without extensive exposition. Atlantis in gaming becomes whatever the gameplay requires: a dungeon to explore, a civilization to manage, a mystery to solve, freed entirely from historical constraints. Even academic philosophy continues to find value in Atlantis as a thought experiment. Political theorists use it to explore questions about ideal governance, sustainability, and the relationship between power and virtue. Environmental scholars cite Atlantis as an early example of ecological thinking, a recognition that civilizations exist within natural systems they cannot control and will be destroyed if they exceed those systems' carrying capacity. The environmental reading of Atlantis has become increasingly prominent as climate change and ecological crisis have moved to the center of public consciousness. In this interpretation, Atlantis serves as a warning about what happens when civilizations ignore natural limits in pursuit of endless growth and expansion. The sinking beneath the waves becomes a metaphor for ecological collapse, not divine punishment, but a natural consequence of treating the Earth as an unlimited resource. This environmental Atlantis resonates differently than traditional religious or mystical interpretations. It doesn't require believing in lost spiritual wisdom or ancient super technology. It simply asks us to notice that Plato's story describes a civilization that grew too powerful, expanded too aggressively, and ultimately faced destruction from natural forces it couldn't control. The parallel to modern industrial civilization is uncomfortable and obvious. Psychologists have been interested in why Atlantis exercises such a hold over human imagination. Carl Jung and his followers saw it as an archetype, a fundamental pattern in human consciousness that recurs across cultures because it addresses universal psychological needs. In this reading, Atlantis represents the ideal self or society that we imagine but cannot quite achieve, forever just out of reach beneath the waves of time and forgetfulness. The Golden Age thinking that Atlantis embodies appears in virtually every culture. Most human societies have myths about a better time in the past when people lived longer, were wiser, and existed in harmony with nature and each other. These Golden Ages ended through some kind of fall, human sin, divine punishment, or simply the inevitable decay of all things. Atlantis fits this pattern perfectly, giving Greek Golden Age thinking a specific geographical and historical form. This persistent nostalgia for imagined better times raises interesting questions. Why do people so often assume the past was superior to the present? Is it genuine historical memory, distorted by time until only the positive aspects remain? Is it psychological compensation for present difficulties, creating an imaginary past that provides comfort and escape? Or is it something more fundamental about how human consciousness relates to time, always projecting perfection into an inaccessible past or future rather than finding it in the experienced present? Artists have been drawn to Atlantis for obvious reasons. It combines visual spectacle with philosophical depth, allowing for both stunning imagery and meaningful content. Paintings of Atlantis often show the moment of destruction, with massive waves overwhelming elaborate architecture while tiny figures flee hopelessly. These images capture both the grandeur of human achievement and its ultimate fragility, material splendor rendered temporary by natural forces beyond control. Contemporary interest in Atlantis often focuses on what the story might teach about our own civilization's trajectory. Are we the new Atlantis, wealthy, powerful, and technologically sophisticated, but losing touch with the values that would make our success sustainable? The parallel seems obvious enough that political commentators across the spectrum invoke Atlantis when warning about various threats to modern civilization. Whether those threats come from environmental degradation, political corruption, social decay, or technological overreach. The fact that Atlantis can be invoked to support contradictory political positions, as both a warning about government overreach and about insufficient collective action, as both an example of cultural decadence and of imperial ambition, demonstrates its flexibility as a symbol. Like any sufficiently rich myth, it contains enough complexity to be interpreted multiple ways depending on which elements you emphasize and which you background. In popular culture, Atlantis has become shorthand for lost advanced civilization in general. When someone refers to something as the Atlantis of a particular region or period, they mean an impressive civilization that mysteriously disappeared. This usage treats Atlantis as a category rather than a specific place. Anything sufficiently ancient, impressive, and vanished can be an Atlantis. The mental life of Atlantis, its existence in imagination and culture rather than geography, has proven far more vigorous than any attempt to locate it physically. This shouldn't surprise us given how Plato created the story in the first place. He invented Atlantis as an idea, a philosophical proposal about what happens when civilizations prioritize power over wisdom. The idea is proven durable precisely because it addresses something real about human social organization, even if the specific civilization was fictional. As you settle more deeply into rest, notice how a story that began as a philosophical thought experiment in ancient Athens has become a cultural touchstone that each generation reinvents according to its own needs and concerns. The Atlantis in our minds changes shape like water, flowing into whatever conceptual spaces our particular historical moment provides, always maintaining its basic form while adapting its details to new contexts. This mental Atlantis, infinitely flexible, endlessly reinterpretable, never quite pinned down, might be the civilization's most remarkable achievement. By not existing in physical space, It can exist everywhere in imaginative space, available to whoever needs a symbol for lost perfection, vanished wisdom, or civilizational fragility. Plato created something more lasting than any actual city could have been, an idea that survives precisely because it was never limited by the constraints of historical fact. As we come to rest at the end of our journey through Atlantis, the imagined, the searched for, and the endlessly reinterpreted, it's worth spending these final moments reflecting on what this story has meant across the centuries, and what it might still offer to anyone willing to think quietly about its implications. Picture yourself floating just beneath the surface of a calm sea, perhaps near where Plato imagined Atlantis once stood. The water is clear enough that sunlight penetrates down to where you drift, creating those moving patterns of light and shadow on the sand below that shift with each passing wave above. The pressure of the water provides gentle, even resistance to any movement, that sensation of being supported and surrounded that makes floating so restful. In this imagined underwater space, you can see the outlines of what might once have been buildings, geometric forms worn smooth by centuries of current, colonized now by corals and seaweed that soften all the hard edges. Small fish move through spaces that might once have been windows or doorways, indifferent to whatever human purposes these structures originally served. Everything that was sharp has been rounded, everything that was solid has been infiltrated by growing things, and everything that was dry has been saturated with salt water. This is what becomes of human ambitions given enough time. Not destroyed, exactly, but transformed into something no longer recognizable for its original purposes. The stone remains but serves as a habitat now. The careful geometric planning is still visible, but reads as a natural formation to anyone who doesn't know its history. What was made becomes unmade gradually, patiently, through processes that care nothing for preserving human meaning. There's something deeply restful about this vision. Not the catastrophic destruction Plato described, earthquakes and floods consuming a civilization in a day and night, but the slow transformation that comes after, when natural processes reclaim human constructions and incorporate them into new patterns of life. The coral growing on Atlantean walls doesn't mourn the civilization that fell. The fish swimming through the palace make no judgments about whether the kings who once ruled there were wise or corrupt. Everything simply continues in new forms. This longer view offers perspective on all human achievement and failure. The things we build, physical structures, social institutions, cultural traditions, all seem so solid and permanent while we're building them. We imagine they'll last forever, that we're creating something that will stand against time, and sometimes our constructions do last a remarkably long time. But eventually, everything we make becomes raw material for whatever comes next. Plato understood this at some level. That's why he set Atlantis in the distant past rather than the present, and why he had it destroyed rather than evolving into something new. The story needed the finality of total destruction to make its philosophical point about the relationship between virtue and sustainability. But the actual process of civilizational change is usually less dramatic, more like erosion than earthquake, more like fish moving into abandoned buildings than waves overwhelming inhabited ones. The lesson isn't that nothing matters because everything eventually changes form. Rather, it's that what matters isn't permanence but how we inhabit the time we have. The Atlanteans lived meaningful lives, raised families, created art, built buildings, governed cities, even though their civilization was temporary. The fact that it ended doesn't retroactively render their existence meaningless. They lived as fully as they could given what they knew and the circumstances they faced. This applies to our own lives and civilizations as well. We build knowing that what we build won't last forever, but we build anyway because the building itself has value independent of its durability. We create societies knowing they'll eventually transform into something we wouldn't recognize, but we try to make them just and flourishing anyway, because justice and flourishing matter in the present regardless of future obsolescence. The underwater Atlantis of imagination offers another kind of lesson about depth and surface. The visible world, the one we usually attend to, is like the surface of the ocean, agitated by wind and current, constantly changing, never quite stable. Below the surface lie deeper patterns and structures, the underlying reality that supports surface phenomena without being immediately visible. Plato's philosophy always insisted on this distinction between surface appearance and underlying reality. His theory of forms suggested that true reality exists in an eternal realm of perfect ideas, while physical existence offers only imperfect copies and shadows. Atlantis functions as a story about this distinction. The beautiful surface civilization built on foundations that were slowly weakening, the visible success masking invisible moral decay. For us, this might translate into paying attention to foundations, asking whether our visible achievements rest on sustainable bases, whether surface success masks deeper problems we're ignoring. It's the kind of reflection that doesn't come naturally when things seem to be going well, but becomes urgent when we notice cracks in structures we thought were solid. The gentle, consistent pressure of water on the imagined Atlantean ruins offers a final metaphor worth considering. Time and natural processes don't attack human constructions violently. They simply persist, applying steady pressure in ways that eventually wear down any resistance. What seems solid proves to be temporary when subjected to forces that operate on geological rather than human timescales. This isn't depressing if you think about it properly, it's actually freeing. The pressure to make everything permanent, to create achievements that will last forever, to ensure your significance echoes through eternity. These pressures dissolve when you recognize that nothing lasts forever in physical form. You can relax into creating things that matter now, serving purposes in the present without needing to guarantee eternal relevance. The fish don't care whether they're swimming through the ruins of a great civilization or natural rock formations. They're just living their fish lives, eating smaller fish, avoiding larger fish, and reproducing when conditions permit. There's something admirable about this pragmatic indifference to human hierarchies of meaning. The ocean doesn't distinguish between grand palaces and simple homes, once both have been underwater long enough. This might be the deepest teaching of Atlantis, that all our status distinctions, all our categorizations of important and trivial, great and ordinary, will eventually be leveled by time and natural processes. Not because nothing matters, but because everything matters equally in its own time and place. The coral doesn't prefer growing on palace walls over growing on humble homes. The sand fills all structures with the same patient efficiency. If Atlantis did exist and did sink beneath the waves, this is what would have become of it by now. Not a treasure trove of ancient wisdom waiting to be recovered, but a series of formations where marine life goes about its business, where sediment accumulates, and where natural processes have long since erased most traces of human intention. And that's fine. That's how the world works. Human civilizations arise, flourish, decline, and are incorporated back into the natural systems from which they emerged. As you drift now towards sleep, you might carry with you this image of underwater ruins where fish swim through empty windows and coral decorates forgotten walls. Not as something sad, but as something peaceful. A reminder that all our striving eventually finds rest, that the pressure to achieve and build and leave permanent marks can be released into the patient processes that transform everything over time. The water supports you. The gentle movement of the current rocks you slowly, rhythmically, like a parent rocking a child towards sleep. Below you, the sand holds whatever remains of things that mattered intensely to people now long gone. Above you, the surface catches sunlight and transforms it into moving patterns that dance across every underwater surface. You float between the two, suspended in the present moment, supported by water that's been cycling through oceans for millions of years. This is what Plato's Atlantis offers us finally. Not a historical mystery to solve or a technological achievement to recover, but a contemplative space where we can reflect on achievement and loss, building and decay, and the difference between surface success and deep sustainability. The story creates room for thinking about how we live, what we build, and what we leave behind when time and nature eventually reclaim everything. The remarkable thing about Atlantis is that it exists now more vigorously than it ever did in Plato's imagination. The story has been retold so many times, adapted to so many purposes, that it's become a permanent part of human cultural inheritance. A story we tell ourselves, about our capacity for achievement and our tendency towards self-destruction. Plato wrote perhaps 15 pages about Atlantis in his dialogues. Those 15 pages have generated millions of pages of speculation, interpretation, and imaginative elaboration. The return on investment is extraordinary. Few authors have created something so durable from such an economical initial description. The sparse specificity of Plato's account, detailed enough to seem real, vague enough to invite interpretation, created space for everyone who came after to project their own ideas about lost perfection. In this way, Atlantis has become a truly collaborative creation, built not by one author, but by thousands of people across dozens of centuries, each adding their interpretation while the core story remains recognizable. It's like a ship that's been at sea so long that every plank has been replaced multiple times, yet it's still somehow the same ship. The continuity exists in pattern and function rather than material substance. For a bedtime story, Atlantis works beautifully because it operates on the border between knowledge and dream. It's specific enough that you can visualize it clearly. Those circular harbours, those walls plated with mysterious metals, those fountains and gardens and temples, but dreamlike enough that the images can shift and flow as consciousness moves towards sleep. The story provides structure without rigid boundaries and guidance without constraint. As consciousness releases its grip on waking concerns, the mind often drifts into a liminal space where metaphor and reality blur together, where the distinction between historical fact and philosophical truth becomes less important. This is the space where Atlantis has always existed most vividly, not in any particular ocean depth or geographical coordinates, but in the twilight region where we think about human possibility, achievement, limitation, and loss. Tomorrow you'll wake to whatever challenges and opportunities your particular moment in history provides. You'll navigate social structures and natural environments that are neither as perfect as Atlantis in its golden age, nor as doomed as Atlantis in its decline. Like most human experience, your actual life will be mixed, containing elements of achievement and failure, wisdom and folly, sustainable practices and unsustainable pressures. But you'll carry with you, perhaps unconsciously, the patterns and questions that Atlantis raises. When you see visible success built on questionable foundations, you might remember the civilization that seemed most powerful just before it sank. When you notice how difficult it is to maintain standards and values across generations, you might recall how divine wisdom was gradually diluted in Atlantean bloodlines. When you recognize the gap between ideal visions and practical realities, you're engaging with exactly the tensions Plato explored through his imaginary civilization. These aren't ancient questions, they're human questions, as relevant now as they were in 4th century Athens, as urgent in every era that has ever grappled with how to build sustainable, just, flourishing societies. Atlantis endures because it addresses something permanent in human experience. The desire for perfection, the tendency toward corruption, the relationship between virtue and fortune, and the inevitability of change and loss. The ocean that swallowed Atlantis continues to move in its rhythmic patterns, waves rising and falling as they've risen and fallen for millions of years before human civilizations existed, and will continue rising and falling long after our particular moment passes into history. This continuity provides context for human striving. We're participating in something much larger and longer than individual lives or even civilizations, part of natural processes that operate on scales we can barely comprehend. Rest now in this knowledge. Whatever you're building, whatever concerns occupied your waking hours, whatever achievements or failures marked your day, all of it takes place within this larger pattern of arising, flourishing, declining, and transforming into something new. You're held in the same way the imagined underwater ruins are held by the ocean, not gripped tightly but supported gently. allowed to be exactly what you are in this moment while time and nature do their patient work of transformation. The philosopher Plato, long dead now, his body returned to the elements that composed it, nevertheless continues speaking to anyone willing to listen to his story about Atlantis. Not because he discovered some secret history or preserved some ancient wisdom, but because he understood something true about how human civilizations work and found a way to express that understanding through memorable narrative. His greatest achievement wasn't the philosophical system he built or the political theories he proposed. It was creating stories that would outlast stone, stories that exist now in millions of minds across the world, changing slightly with each retelling while maintaining their essential character. Stories that help us think about who we are, how we live, and what we might become if we pay attention to the patterns repeating throughout human history. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of this ongoing conversation about human possibility and limitation that stretches back through centuries and forward into an uncertain future. The questions Plato raised through Atlantis about virtue and power, wisdom and corruption, sustainability and collapse, are your questions now, to be answered through how you live and what you choose to build or preserve or transform. And perhaps in your dreams, you'll swim through underwater ruins where sunlight filters down through clear water and small fish move unconcerned through spaces that once held human hopes and ambitions. You'll see how time and nature are the ultimate artists, taking everything we make and slowly, patiently transforming it into something beautiful in entirely new ways. You'll understand that this transformation isn't loss, but continuation, not ending, but a change of form. The story of Atlantis ends where it begins, in imagination, in the space where we reflect on what it means to be human, and to build civilizations that are always temporary, always imperfect, and yet always meaningful for those who inhabit them. May this reflection carry you gently into sleep, into dreams, into the rest that allows tomorrow's building to begin again. Imagine you're living in England in the autumn of 1703, and your life moves at the pace of a horse-drawn cart. There are no weather apps on your phone because there are no phones. No meteorologists are tracking pressure systems because the barometer has only recently been invented, and most people think it's some kind of scientific curiosity rather than a practical tool. Queen Anne sits on the throne, having recently succeeded her brother-in-law William III. The country is embroiled in the War of Spanish Succession, which is one of those complicated European conflicts where everyone seems to be fighting everyone else over inheritances and territory. But for ordinary people, war is something that happens far away, while the real concerns are much closer to home, bringing in the harvest, fixing the thatch on the roof before winter, and making sure there's enough firewood stacked for the cold months ahead. November in England means the farming season is winding down. The fields have been harvested, the animals are being prepared for winter, and people are settling into that cosy rhythm of shorter days and longer nights. It's the time of year when you're grateful for a solid roof, a warm hearth, and walls that keep out the wind. The houses of 1703 would seem almost impossibly fragile to you now. Most buildings outside major cities are timber frame with walls made of wattle and daub, basically sticks and mud with some hope mixed in. Roofs are thatched with straw or reeds, held down by wooden pegs and prayer. Even in London, which is rebuilding after the Great Fire of 1666, many structures are still partially wooden. Glass windows are expensive luxuries. So many homes make do with oiled paper or wooden shutters. The English countryside is dotted with windmills that grind grain into flour. These tall wooden structures turn their sails to catch the wind, like patient sentinels watching over the fields. There are hundreds of them, essential to feeding the population, standing on hilltops and in valleys where the wind blows strongest. They're marvels of engineering for their time, though they have one significant vulnerability that nobody has quite solved. They're extremely susceptible to strong winds. Churches rise above most villages, their stone towers and wooden steeples pointing toward heaven like fingers in prayer. These spires can be seen for miles around, helping travellers navigate and reminding everyone of the central place religion holds in daily life. The church bells mark the hours, call people to worship and warn of danger. They're the communication system of the age, ringing out messages across the landscape. Along the coasts, maritime life pulses with constant activity. The Royal Navy maintains dozens of warships in various ports, while merchant vessels crowd the harbours, loading and unloading goods from around the world. Portsmouth, Plymouth and the Thames estuary are forests of masts and rigging. Sailors live lives that alternate between the tedium of port maintenance and the danger of sea voyages, where storms are an accepted occupational hazard. The weather in late 1703 has been odd. Not dramatically so, but enough that people notice. There have been unusually strong winds throughout November, the kind that make you lean into your walk and hold onto your hat. Trees have been shedding their leaves earlier than usual, as if they know something the humans don't. Old-timers, the kind who claim to feel storms in their bones, have been muttering about the signs. Red skies at odd hours, birds behaving strangely, and an unsettled feeling in the air itself. But England has weathered storms before. This is an island nation after all, surrounded by temperamental seas and subject to whatever weather the Atlantic decides to send its way. People have learned to bend with the wind, to secure their belongings and to wait out whatever nature throws at them. They've survived Norse raiders, the Black Death, Civil War and the Great Fire. How bad could a little wind be? This sense of resilient confidence, this very British attitude of muddling through, is about to be tested in ways no one can imagine. Because the storm that's gathering out in the Atlantic isn't a normal autumn gale, is not even an exceptional storm by the usual standards. It's something else entirely. A meteorological monster that will make weather history and haunt European consciousness for generations. The last week of November 1703 feels like nature is taking a deep breath before screaming. You step outside on November 24th, and the air has that peculiar quality that makes the hair on your arm stand up. It's not just cold, it's charged, electric, as if the atmosphere itself is holding tension like a drawn bowstring. The sky takes on colours that don't appear in normal weather. There are brassy yellows near the horizon, deep purples in the clouds, and that particular shade of green that experienced sailors know means trouble. The clouds themselves seem to be moving in several directions at once, low scud racing across the sky, while higher formations lumber along at different angles. It's like watching a badly choreographed dance, where none of the performers can agree on the music. Birds are acting strangely, and if you were the noticing type, this would concern you. Seagulls, those perpetual optimists of the avian world, have moved inland en masse. Crows gather in unusual numbers, making a racket that sounds almost like warnings. Even the farm animals seem unsettled. Horses stamp and whinny in their stables, cows refuse to go into their barns, and dogs pace nervously, whining at their owners. The barometer, in the few places where such newfangled instruments exist, is doing something unprecedented. It's falling, but not in the gradual way that suggests an approaching storm. It's plummeting like a stone dropped in water, faster than anyone has seen before. Daniel Defoe, who will later document this storm in extraordinary detail, owns one of these instruments. He watches it drop and wonders if perhaps the device is broken. Surely the air pressure can't actually be falling this rapidly. November 26th dawns with an eerie calm. The wind that has been bothering people for weeks has died down to almost nothing. The air feels heavy, thick, like trying to breathe through a damp wool blanket. This is the kind of stillness that precedes something significant, though most people interpret it as a relief. Finally, they think, the winds have stopped. Perhaps they can get some repairs done, secure their properties properly, and maybe even sleep without the constant whistling and rattling. But seasoned sailors and shepherds, people whose lives depend on reading weather, know better. This isn't peaceful calm. This is nature pausing for effect, like a storyteller taking a breath before the climax. The old maritime saying comes to mind, calm before the storm, though in this case, storm is going to prove a grossly inadequate word for what's approaching. By the evening of November 26th, the wind returns, but it's different now. It's no longer the blustery autumn breeze people have grown accustomed to. It's purposeful, building with an almost conscious intent, like something that has decided to stop playing around and get serious. The sound changes too, from the familiar whistle and moan to a deeper, more ominous roar that seems to come from everywhere at once. People begin their evening preparations with growing uneasiness. You secure your shutters, bring in anything from the yard that might blow away, and double-check that the animals are safely housed. In coastal towns, sailors look at their moored vessels with worried expressions, wondering if the ropes and chains will hold. Ship captains who can put out additional anchors and say prayers to whatever saints specialise in maritime protection. As darkness falls on November 26th, the wind continues to build. It's no longer just moving air, it's becoming a physical presence, something you can lean against, something that pushes back. The sound grows from a roar to something that resembles continuous thunder, a bass note that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Inside homes across southern England, families gather close to their fires, trying to ignore the increasingly alarming noises from outside. Shutters begin to rattle despite being latched. The wind finds every gap in the walls, every crack around doors and windows, creating whistling harmonics that would sound almost musical if they weren't so unsettling. Thatch roofs start to lift and settle, like the building itself is breathing heavily. Around midnight, the storm stops building and simply arrives in its full fury. It's as if someone has flipped a switch from very bad weather to apocalyptic nightmare. The wind doesn't just blow anymore, it hammers, it screams, it attacks. The sound becomes so overwhelming that it's almost impossible to think clearly. Imagine standing next to a jet engine and you're getting close to the volume and intensity of what people are experiencing. And here's the thing that makes this storm so strange, so different from normal tempests. It's not coming from a single direction. The wind seems to swirl and eddy, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. This isn't a weather pattern people understand. Storms have directions, they have fronts, and they move in predictable ways. This storm seems to be everywhere at once, a circular fury that defies normal meteorological behaviour. What nobody realises yet, because the science doesn't exist to understand it, is that they're experiencing something exceptionally rare. A bomb cyclone, what modern meteorologists call explosive cyclogenesis. The atmospheric pressure is dropping so rapidly that the storm is intensifying at a rate that occurs perhaps once or twice a century. The rotating winds are reaching speeds that won't be scientifically measured for another 150 years, when someone invents proper instruments for such things. As the night of November 26th deepens into the early hours of November 27th, everyone in southern England is about to experience the longest, most terrifying night of their lives. And the truly horrifying part, the storm is still intensifying. Picture yourself huddled in a stone cottage somewhere in Kent as the clock approaches 2 a.m. on November 27th. The fire in your hearth is being sucked up the chimney by the incredible draught, sending sparks and smoke into the room. Every few seconds, the entire building shudders as if being struck by a giant's fist. The noise is beyond description. Imagine a freight train, a waterfall, and continuous thunder all happening at once, and you're still not quite there. The thatch roof above your head is now lifting in sections. You can actually see it moving and feel the sudden drafts of freezing air as gaps appear, and then close again. Bits of straw are falling into the room like strange snow. You're making calculations about whether it's safer to stay inside a building that might collapse, or venture outside into wind that could literally knock you off your feet and blow you across the countryside. Across southern England, roofs are now leaving buildings entirely, not being damaged, leaving. Whole thatched roofs lift off like birds taking flight, sailing through the air in one piece before disintegrating into golden clouds of straw that scatter across the landscape. Tiles and slates become projectiles, flying through the air with enough force to embed themselves in walls or tragically in anything living that happens to be in their path. The windmills that have stood sentinel over the countryside are experiencing catastrophic failures. Their sails, designed to catch the wind efficiently, are now catching far too much of it. Unable to be shut down or furled fast enough, the mills begin spinning at impossible speeds. The wooden gears inside, never meant for such rotation rates, start smoking from friction. Some mills simply explode from the centrifugal force, sending massive wooden beams flying through the air like enormous javelins. Others catch fire from the friction of their overspinning machinery, becoming bizarre torches in the storm-racked night. Church steeples, those proud fingers pointing to heaven, are toppling. The spire of St Mary's in Somerset goes first, crashing through the roof of the church itself. Then dozens more across the south follow suit, their lead-covered wooden frames no match for winds that are essentially trying to tear England apart. Each falling steeple makes a sound like a forest tree being felled, a groaning crack followed by an enormous crash. For deeply religious people, seeing churches destroyed feels especially ominous. If God's houses aren't safe, what hope do ordinary buildings have? In London, the scene is apocalyptic. The city, still recovering from the Great Fire of 1666, is being battered by winds that are methodically undoing decades of reconstruction. Roof tiles fly through the streets like deadly frisbees. Chimneys topple, sending bricks raining down onto cobblestones below. Anyone foolish or desperate enough to be outside quickly realizes their mistake, as the wind shoves them against walls or literally lifts them off their feet. The Thames is behaving in ways nobody has seen before. The wind is so powerful that it's actually pushing water upstream, reversing the river's flow. Waves are forming on the river's surface. Waves on a river in central London. Barges and small boats moored at the docks are being tossed like bath toys, breaking their moorings and crashing into each other or smashing against the embankments. Daniel Defoe, future author of Robinson Crusoe but currently a somewhat controversial political writer, is in his London home watching what he describes as tiles flying past his windows like autumn leaves. He's making mental notes for what will become the world's first real investigative journalism piece about a natural disaster. Between flinching at each new crash and bang, he's already planning how to document this night for posterity. But the truly catastrophic scenes are playing out along the coast and at sea. At the Eddystone Lighthouse, perched on rocks 14 miles off the coast of Plymouth, the situation is beyond desperate. This is the first lighthouse ever built on these treacherous rocks, completed just 5 years earlier. It's a wooden structure, which seems insane now, but was considered reasonable engineering at the time. The lighthouse keeper, Henry Winstanley, is actually at the lighthouse, having gone out to perform repairs just days before. The lighthouse is flexing and swaying in ways that wooden structures should never flex and sway. Around 2 a.m, a wave larger than any in recorded memory hits the lighthouse. When dawn eventually comes, the lighthouse is simply gone, vanished as completely as if it never existed. Henry Winstanley, his crew, and the entire structure have been erased from the ocean. Not a single piece of wreckage will ever be found. In Portsmouth Harbour, the Royal Navy is experiencing its worst peacetime disaster in history. Dozens of warships are moored here, and as the storm intensifies, their anchors begin to drag. These aren't small boats. Some are 3-decked ships of the line, massive wooden castles that carry hundreds of men and dozens of cannon. But in this wind, they're as helpless as children's toys. Ships begin colliding with each other in the darkness. The sound of wooden hulls grinding together is audible even over the storm. Masts snap with cracks like cannon fire. Rigging tangles between ships, creating a chaos of rope and canvas that makes it impossible to separate vessels even if anyone could work on deck, which they can't. The wind is strong enough to blow men off their feet and over the railings into the churning water below. Some ships are being driven onto the shore despite their anchors. The HMS Association, a 90-gun ship of the line, drags her anchors and grounds near the Isle of Wight. The HMS Restoration snaps her anchor cables and is driven onto the mudflats where she'll eventually sink, All across the southern coast from Bristol to Kent, ships are meeting similar fates. Merchant vessels, fishing boats, and naval ships are all equally helpless before the storm's fury. The human cost at sea is staggering. Sailors who have survived battles, storms, and years of hard service are drowning within sight of their home ports. Some are trapped below decks in ships that are flooding. Others are washed overboard into water so violent that rescue is impossible, even if anyone could mount an attempt, which they can't. The Navy alone will lose over 1,000 men this night, more than most naval battles of the era. Inland, trees that have stood for centuries are falling by the thousands. Ancient oaks that were already old when Shakespeare was born topple like dominoes. Entire forests are being flattened, creating lunar landscapes of fallen timber that will take decades to clear. The new forest loses an estimated 4,000 ancient trees in a single night. Deer, foxes, badgers, and birds that depend on these trees are being crushed or left homeless. Agricultural damage is catastrophic. Barns and storage buildings collapse, crushing livestock and destroying the winter food supplies that farming families depend on. Haystacks that represent months of labour scatter across the countryside. Sheep and cattle, terrified by the noise and unable to find shelter, huddle in fields where some are actually blown over and killed by the force of the wind. A detail so bizarre that people will initially refuse to believe the reports. As the storm rages through the early hours of November 27th, people huddle in whatever shelter they can find, listening to their world being torn apart. Every crash, every splintering sound, every moment when the wind seems to increase impossibly beyond what it already was, it all contributes to a growing certainty that this isn't a normal storm. This is something unprecedented, something that's revealing just how fragile human civilization really is when nature decides to stop being cooperative. And still, remarkably, the storm continues to intensify. Let's focus on individual moments within this catastrophic night, because statistics and general descriptions can't quite capture what it means to live through something like this. These are the human stories, the small dramas playing out across southern England while the great drama of the storm rages on. In a small village in Sussex, a family of 7 huddles in their cottage as the walls begin to crack. The father, a farmer named Thomas, has moved everyone into the oldest part of the house, the stone section that his grandfather built 60 years ago. The newer timber-framed rooms are already showing alarming signs of stress, with beams visibly shifting and walls leaning. Around 3 a.m. the decision makes itself. With a sound like 1,000 trees breaking at once, the timber section of their home simply disintegrates. One moment it's there, the next it's gone, scattered across the countryside in a million pieces. The family packed into the stone room survives because of a building decision made 2 generations earlier by a careful craftsman who mixed his mortar properly and chose good stone. In the morning they'll walk out to find that everything they owned except what's in this one room is gone, spread across 3 counties. Meanwhile, in Bristol, a midwife named Eleanor is facing an impossible decision. A woman has gone into labour and complications mean Eleanor needs to reach her quickly. But going outside in this storm is madness. The streets are rivers of flying debris, and the wind is strong enough to make walking nearly impossible. Eleanor looks at the storm, looks at her bag of instruments and herbs, thinks about the woman and unborn child and makes the choice. She wraps herself in every piece of heavy clothing she owns and sets out into the tempest. Her journey of less than half a mile takes over an hour. She crawls part of the way, holding onto walls and fences, moving between buildings when the wind briefly lessens. A roof tile strikes her shoulder, leaving a bruise but fortunately not breaking a bone. At one point, a gust simply lifts her off her feet and deposits her 10 feet away. But Eleanor keeps going, driven by professional duty and sheer stubbornness, until she reaches her patient. The baby will be born healthy just after dawn, and Eleanor will later say that bringing life into the world during history's deadliest storm gave her a perspective on resilience that she never lost. Out at sea, the situation is a pure nightmare. On the HMS Mary, a 4th-rate ship with 50 guns, the crew has done everything right. Anchors are down, sails are furled and hatches are battened. But the wind is so strong that the ship is dragging her anchors anyway, moving slowly but inexorably toward the rocky shore of the Isle of Wight. The captain knows what's coming. He can feel it through the ship's timbers, that subtle change in motion that tells an experienced seaman that his vessel is doomed. He can't save the ship, but perhaps he can save the crew. He orders everyone into the rigging, counterintuitive, but it gets them high above the deck before the ship grounds. When the Mary finally strikes the rocks around 4 a.m, the impact is so violent that it tears the bottom out of the hull. The ship floods in minutes, but most of the crew, clinging to the masts and yards, survive until dawn, when rescuers can reach them. Not everyone is so fortunate. The HMS Northumberland, a large merchant vessel pressed into Navy service, breaks free of her moorings in Portsmouth and is driven directly into the path of the HMS Mary. The two ships collide in the darkness with a grinding, splintering crash that can be heard on shore over the wind. The Northumberland's masts fall like trees, crushing men who have no time to escape. The ship begins taking on water immediately, and in the chaos and darkness, rescue is impossible. Of her crew of 200, fewer than 20 will see the dawn. In Kent, a shepherd named William has been caught away from home when the storm truly hit. He's taken shelter in a small stone hut used for storing tools, basically 4 walls and a solid roof, no windows and 1 door. It's cramped and cold, but it's stone and it's holding. William settles in to wait out the storm, listening to the unbelievable fury outside and probably thinking about every poor decision that led to him being here instead of home in his own bed. Around midnight, William hears something over the storm, an odd bleating sound. Opening the door slightly, he finds a ewe from his flock terrified and pressed against the wall. He pulls her inside. Within an hour, 3 more sheep have found his shelter. Then a fox appears, and William's first instinct is to drive it away. But something about the absolute terror in the animal's eyes makes him hesitate. The fox slinks into a corner as far from the sheep as possible and lies there shaking. They'll all survive the night together in that tiny stone hut. Predator and prey united by fear of something worse than each other. Back in London, Westminster Abbey is suffering devastating damage. This isn't some wooden structure, but a massive stone building that has stood for centuries. Yet the wind is finding weaknesses that nobody knew existed. Lead sheets on the roof are peeling back like paper. Flying debris has broken several ancient stained glass windows. Most dramatically, the Abbey's roof, which weighs several tons, actually lifts and shifts, dropping back down at a slight angle. The architectural damage will take years to properly repair. The Tower of London, that ancient fortress that has withstood sieges, fires and political upheavals, is experiencing something new. The wind is so strong that it's actually pushing in the leaded windows. The famous ravens that live in the tower, who according to legend protect England by their presence, have all taken shelter in the deepest, most protected corners of the fortress. Even birds that are essentially carrion eaters, built to handle harsh conditions, know when to admit defeat. In Portsmouth, a naval officer named Samuel Pepys, not the diarist but a distant relative, is trapped aboard his ship making impossible decisions. His vessel has dragged anchor and is heading toward the rocks, but the storm is so violent that he can't order men on deck without essentially sending them to their deaths. He watches 3 ships collide nearby, sees masts fall, and hears the screams of men going into the water. There's nothing he can do. Command in this storm is meaningless. Nature is in charge now, and all human authority is temporarily suspended. Around 4 a.m, something shifts in the storm's character. It doesn't weaken, if anything this is the peak of its fury. But the wind begins to change direction, swinging around from the southwest to the west and then northwest. This rotation means that places that had been somewhat protected by geography now get hit with full force, while areas that had borne the brunt for hours get brief, relative respites. This wind shift causes a new wave of destruction. Buildings that had survived by facing away from the wind now have it hitting them from unexpected angles. Ships that had positioned themselves carefully for southwest winds find themselves broadside to northwest gales. The wind shift feels almost malicious, as if the storm is making sure nothing escapes its attention. On the coast of Hampshire, a small fishing village experiences what locals will later describe as the most terrifying hour of the night. The wind had been bad but survivable, then the shift happens, and suddenly the wind is coming straight off the ocean with nothing to block it. The entire village's fishing fleet, 20 small boats drawn up on the beach, is picked up and thrown against the seawall. Houses nearest the water are struck by waves that have no business being that large. 3 cottages simply collapse into the sea, which is now reaching places it has never reached before. The village church, which sits on a slight rise and has been a landmark for 200 years, loses its entire roof in one piece. The roof simply lifts off, sails several hundred yards inland, and lands in a field where it will remain largely intact. The church bell falls from the tower and rolls down into the village square, where it will stay for weeks because it's too heavy to move easily, and there are far more pressing concerns. As the first hints of grey light begin to appear in the eastern sky, though light is a generous term for the murky dimness that passes for dawn on November 27th, people begin to realise that they might actually survive this. The storm is still raging, but there's a subtle lessening of intensity, a sense that perhaps the worst has passed. Of course, nobody can be sure. The storm has already defied every expectation and broken every rule. Who's to say it won't suddenly intensify again? But slowly, gradually, the wind does begin to decrease. Not quickly, this isn't like a switch being flipped off, but measurably. By 6 a.m, it's possible to stand outside without being knocked down, though you still need to lean into the wind and watch for flying debris. By 7 a.m, the wind has dropped to what would normally be called gale force, which after the horrors of the night feels almost calm by comparison. The storm isn't over. It will continue to batter parts of England and move on to ravage sections of Europe for another day, but the absolute peak, that nightmare period between midnight and dawn, is finally ending. People begin to emerge from whatever shelter they found, stepping out into a world that has been fundamentally transformed. Imagine stepping out of your shelter as the grey light of November 27th grows strong enough to actually see by. The wind is still blowing hard, but compared to the night's fury, it feels almost gentle. The first thing that strikes you is the smell. Fresh wood from thousands of broken trees, salt spray carried miles inland from the sea, disturbed earth from buildings that have collapsed, and smoke from fires that have broken out in the chaos. The second thing you notice is the sound. After hours of continuous roaring wind, the relative quiet is almost disorienting. Your ears are ringing from the sustained volume, but there are new sounds now. The crash of delayed structural collapses as buildings that were weakened during the night finally give up. The calls of people searching for family members and neighbours, and the creaking of damaged structures that are still partially standing. Then you look around and your mind struggles to process what you're seeing. The landscape has been transformed so completely that it takes a moment to orient yourself. Trees that were landmarks, that you've used your entire life to navigate, are gone. Buildings that define the skyline have vanished or are now unrecognisable ruins. The village or town you've lived in your whole life has become a foreign country overnight. In the countryside, the devastation is staggering, but at least it's spread out. Entire forests are flattened, yes, but forests were going to be cut down eventually anyway for timber. It's shocking, but it's not as immediately heartbreaking as what's happening in population centres. In towns and cities, the destruction is intimate and immediate. This pile of rubble was the Baker family's house, where Mrs. Baker made the best bread in the village. That scattered timber was the smithy where horses were shod and tools were mended. The church where you were baptised, where your parents were married, and where your grandparents are buried. It's now missing half its roof and its entire steeple. The community's physical memory has been partially erased overnight. People are emerging slowly and cautiously, many of them in shock. you see a woman standing in front of where a house used to be, just standing there staring at the rubble, not moving, not speaking. A man is walking in circles in his yard, picking up random objects, a cooking pot, a child's shoe, a book, holding each one for a moment before setting it down and picking up something else, as if he's lost the ability to decide what's important. Children are crying, some from fear, some from exhaustion, and some from that peculiar distress that comes from having their entire world revealed as less safe and stable than they believed. Dogs are barking frantically, trying to find their owners or protect property that no longer exists. Cats are nowhere to be seen. They've all hidden in whatever deep, dark places they could find and won't emerge for days. The death toll becomes apparent gradually. Someone finds a body under rubble here. Another is discovered in a collapsed building there. A family didn't make it out when their house collapsed. An elderly person, too frail to evacuate to stronger shelter, was crushed when a beam fell. The numbers start to accumulate, and with each discovery the community's shock deepens. In London, the scene is apocalyptic. Streets are impassable, blocked by fallen chimneys, collapsed walls, and debris. The lead merchant's warehouse near the Thames has collapsed, spilling thousands of sheets of lead roofing material into the streets. Tiles and bricks lie everywhere, mixed with broken glass, splintered wood, and scattered belongings from homes that no longer have roofs to protect their contents. Westminster Abbey looks like it's been hit by artillery. The roof damage is extensive, exposing the interior to the elements. Several pinnacles and decorative elements have fallen, smashing into the streets below. The clock tower has stopped working, its mechanism jammed by the building's structural shifts. The Queen will later be told that the damage to the Abbey alone will cost thousands of pounds to repair, a fortune in 1703 money. Daniel Defoe, having survived the night with his family, begins what will become the world's first systematic disaster investigation. He places advertisements in London newspapers, asking people to send him their observations and experiences. He's going to collect data, compile statistics, and create a comprehensive account of the storm. It's revolutionary journalism, using systematic investigation and eyewitness testimony to document a natural disaster. His eventual publication, The Storm, will become a historical document of immense value. Along the coast, the maritime disaster is beyond anything the Royal Navy has experienced in peacetime. Portsmouth Harbour looks like a battlefield. Ships are piled on top of each other, masts are broken and trailing in the water, and hulls are stove in and sinking. Bodies are washing up on shore, sailors who went into the water during the night and never made it out. The Eddystone Light, which stood as a symbol of human engineering triumphing over nature, has vanished completely. Search ships will eventually find the rocks where it stood, but not a single piece of the structure remains. Henry Winstanley, who designed and built the lighthouse, and who famously said he wanted to be inside it during the greatest storm to prove its strength, got his wish in the cruelest way possible. His confidence in his engineering has cost him everything. Merchant ships from around the world have been destroyed. A vessel from the East Indies carrying spices and silk worth a small fortune has sunk in the harbour. A ship from the Americas, loaded with tobacco and sugar, has been driven onto the rocks and broken apart. Insurance companies in London will face bankruptcy from the claims. The financial impact of the storm will ripple through the economy for years. The total ship losses are difficult to calculate initially because ships keep being found wrecked in unexpected places. The wind was strong enough to blow vessels miles from where they should have been. One merchant ship is found several miles inland, blown up a tidal creek and deposited in a farmer's field, like some bizarre sea monster that lost its way. It will stay there for years because moving it is impractical. Eventually, it will just rot in place, becoming a landmark and a reminder. Bishop's Palace in Wells, Somerset has lost most of its roof. Tiles that have protected this building for centuries are gone, scattered across the countryside. Rain is now falling into rooms that haven't been wet since they were built. Ancient manuscripts and documents are being hastily moved to try to save them from water damage. It it will take months to make the palace weatherproof again. Canterbury Cathedral, one of the most important religious sites in England, has suffered damage to its Bell Harry Tower. Stonework that has stood since the 1400s has been weakened or destroyed. Lead sheets have been torn from the roof. The Archbishop will later calculate that the storm has done more damage to the cathedral than was inflicted during the entire Reformation. As people begin to assess the damage and start the overwhelming task of recovery, stories emerge that strain credibility. A woman in Kent claims that her chickens were blown 2 miles from her farm and landed alive but extremely confused in a neighbour's yard. A farmer insists that the wind was so strong it blew the fleece off several of his sheep, a claim that seems impossible until you see the sheep in question, partially sheared by wind and flying debris. Someone finds a haystack from Sussex sitting intact in a field in Kent, blown 20 miles from its original location. A weather vane from a church steeple in Hampshire is discovered embedded in a tree in Dorset, 40 miles away. These objects aren't just blown around. They're becoming projectiles that travel distances that seem to violate the laws of physics. The task of clearing the debris and beginning repairs is overwhelming. In every village, in every town, people are looking at months or years of work. Roofs need to be rebuilt, walls need to be repaired, and trees need to be cleared. And winter is coming. Damaged buildings need to be made weatherproof before the real cold arrives. There's a desperate urgency to the work, driven by the knowledge that another storm, even a normal one, could be catastrophic for buildings that are barely standing. Help begins to arrive from areas that were less affected. The northern counties, which experience strong winds but nothing like the destruction in the south, send workers and materials. The Queen opens the royal purse to help with repairs to churches and public buildings. Wealthy landowners organise relief efforts for their tenants. It's not enough. It can't be enough. But it's something, and in the aftermath of disaster, something is infinitely better than nothing. As the day progresses and the wind continues to die down, people start trying to understand what happened. This is the beginning of a collective attempt to make sense of something that defies comprehension. In an age before modern meteorology, before weather science as we know it, people are reaching for explanations that make sense within their worldview. In the days and weeks following the Great Storm, people across England are asking the same question: what just happened? You have to remember that in 1703, the scientific understanding of weather was primitive at best. The barometer exists, yes, but it's a novelty. The concept of air pressure is understood in abstract terms by a few scientists, but the connection between pressure systems and weather is still being debated in academic circles. Most people's understanding of weather comes from centuries of folk wisdom and religious interpretation. Storms are sent by God, either as punishment for sin or as tests of faith. Weather patterns are influenced by the moon, by the stars, and by various signs and omens that experienced people learn to read. It's not scientific, but it's the framework people have for understanding their world. So when a storm of unprecedented violence strikes without warning and causes unimaginable destruction, the search for meaning becomes urgent. Religious leaders, who serve as the primary interpreters of major events, immediately frame the storm in theological terms. Sermons across the country describe it as divine judgment, though what exactly England is being judged for varies depending on the preacher's particular theological emphasis. Some ministers point to the ongoing war with France, suggesting that God is displeased with the bloodshed. Others focus on moral decay in London, claiming that the storm is punishment for the theatre, gambling, and other vices flourishing in the capital. Still others take a more political angle, suggesting that religious divisions between Anglicans and dissenters have angered the Almighty. These explanations provide comfort in their way. If the storm is divine judgment, then it's not random, it has meaning, purpose, and cause. And if it has a cause, then perhaps it can be prevented next time by improving moral behaviour, reforming religious practices. It's a way of restoring a sense of control in a situation that revealed how little control anyone actually has. Queen Anne, who is deeply religious, orders a national day of fasting and prayer to be held in January. It's both a religious observance and a political statement, acknowledging the disaster while demonstrating royal concern for the nation's welfare. Churches across England will hold special services, and people will pray for the souls of the dead and for protection from future disasters. But not everyone is satisfied with purely religious explanations. A small but growing number of natural philosophers, the term scientist won't be coined for another century, are approaching the storm from a more analytical perspective. They want to understand the physical mechanisms that could produce such extraordinary winds. Daniel Defoe's investigation represents this new way of thinking. He's collecting data systematically, comparing accounts from different locations, and trying to map the storm's path and intensity. He's asking questions like, how fast were the winds? Nobody knows, because instruments to measure wind speed won't be invented until the 1800s. What was the air pressure? The few people with barometers report unprecedented lows, but there's no standard measurement system. Did the storm follow a predictable path? The accounts suggest something strange, a rotating storm system that moved across southern England, but the concept of cyclonic rotation won't be understood for over a century. Robert Hooke, the brilliant but often overlooked scientist who serves as curator of experiments for the Royal Society, has been keeping detailed weather records for years. He reviews his observations from late November and notes the unusual barometric pressure readings. He suspects there's a connection between the rapid pressure drop and the storm's intensity, but he lacks the theoretical framework to explain it properly. The Royal Society, England's premier scientific institution, holds several meetings dedicated to discussing the storm. Members present observations, theories, and speculations. Some of their ideas are surprisingly close to modern understanding. They correctly identify that the storm involved rotating winds and moved from west to east. Other ideas are completely wrong, including suggestions that earthquakes under the Atlantic somehow caused the storm or that unusual planetary alignments influenced atmospheric conditions. What makes the discussion interesting is that they're trying to apply empirical observation and logical reasoning to a natural phenomenon, rather than simply accepting supernatural explanations. This represents an important moment in the development of meteorological science, even if the actual understanding is still primitive. One observation that particularly puzzles natural philosophers is the storm's extraordinary wind speed. Several people report seeing objects blown at velocities that seem impossible. Tiles flying like birds, pieces of roof travelling for miles, people actually being lifted off their feet. These accounts suggest wind speeds far beyond what anyone has measured or documented before. Modern meteorological analysis, conducted centuries later using Defoe's collected accounts and other historical records, suggests that wind speeds during the storm's peak may have reached 120 to 130 miles per hour, possibly higher in gusts. That's Category 3 hurricane strength, but occurring in a latitude where such storms essentially never happen. It's the equivalent of a major Caribbean hurricane somehow appearing in the English Channel, meteorologically bizarre and historically unprecedented. The storm's path is also unusual. Most Atlantic storms that reach England come from the southwest and weaken as they approach land. This storm seems to have intensified as it approached, which violates normal storm behaviour. It also maintained its strength far longer than normal, battering southern England for over 12 hours at peak intensity. Everything about it is exceptional, anomalous, and wrong according to the typical patterns that experienced observers recognise. Agricultural communities are particularly concerned with understanding what happened, because they need to know if it could happen again. If this was a one-time divine judgment, that's one thing. But if it's a weather pattern that might recur, then building practices need to change, farming strategies need to adapt, and communities need to prepare differently for winter storms. The answer, frustratingly, is that nobody knows. This could be a once-in-a-millennium event that won't recur for centuries. Or it could be the first of a new pattern. Maybe the climate is changing. Maybe some fundamental shift in atmospheric conditions has occurred. Without historical records going back more than a generation or two, and without scientific instruments to measure conditions properly, It's impossible to put the storm in proper context. What people do know is that their understanding of what weather can do has been fundamentally revised. Before the storm, people thought they knew the limits of wind strength, the maximum height of waves, and the worst that nature could throw at England. The storm has demonstrated that those limits were imaginary, that nature is capable of violence far beyond what anyone considered possible. This realization is both terrifying and, in an odd way, liberating. If the old certainties about weather are wrong, then perhaps other certainties are also questionable. Maybe the world is more dynamic, more changeable, and more surprising than traditional wisdom suggests. It's an uncomfortable thought, but it's also the kind of thinking that drives scientific progress. Insurance companies are also trying to understand the storm, but for purely practical reasons. They need to calculate risks and set premiums, which requires some ability to predict the likelihood of future disasters. The losses from this storm are bankrupting several insurance firms, and the survivors need to figure out how to price policies in a world where apparently impossible disasters can actually occur. This leads to some of the first attempts at actuarial science applied to weather, trying to use historical records and mathematical probability to estimate storm frequency and intensity. It's crude by modern standards, but it represents the beginning of treating weather disasters as calculable risks rather than simply unpredictable acts of God. As weeks turn to months and England slowly recovers from the Great Storm, the ways it has changed the country begin to emerge. Some changes are obvious and immediate. Thousands of buildings have been rebuilt with stronger construction methods, for instance. Other changes are more subtle, working their way through culture and consciousness in ways that will influence British society for generations. The most immediate legacy is architectural. The storm has provided a brutal lesson in what works and what doesn't when it comes to withstanding extreme winds. Thatched roofs, while traditional and relatively inexpensive, have proven catastrophically vulnerable. In the reconstruction that follows, you can see a shift toward tiles and slates, toward heavier roofing materials that won't simply blow away. Building techniques change too. Timber framing gets reinforced, buildings are anchored more securely to their foundations, and walls are built thicker. There's a new appreciation for stone construction, even though it's more expensive. The storm has essentially provided free but extremely harsh testing of construction methods, and builders are learning from the results. The windmill industry undergoes a complete redesign. The catastrophic failures during the storm, mills spinning themselves to destruction, catching fire or simply exploding, have made it clear that current designs are inadequate. Engineers develop better brake systems, stronger gearing and emergency shutdown mechanisms. Future windmills will be built lower and sturdier, trading some efficiency for much better storm survival. Lighthouse construction sees even more dramatic changes. The complete obliteration of the Eddystone Light makes it clear that wooden structures, no matter how cleverly designed, simply cannot withstand the worst the ocean can throw at them. When the lighthouse is rebuilt, it will be stone, and when that proves insufficient and is replaced again 50 years later, it will be even heavier stone with innovative engineering. The storm effectively ends the era of wooden offshore lighthouses. The Royal Navy learns hard lessons about harbour management and ship security. New mooring systems are developed, harbour configurations are redesigned, and procedures for securing ships during extreme weather are completely overhauled. The loss of so many ships in harbour, where they should have been safe, is an embarrassment that the Navy is determined not to repeat. But beyond these practical changes, the storm leaves deeper marks on British culture and psychology. It becomes a reference point, a benchmark against which all future storms are measured. For generations afterward, people will say things like, "the worst storm since 2003, or "not as bad as the Great Storm." It enters the national memory as a shared trauma that defined an era. The storm also contributes to a slowly growing sense that the world is more knowable and less mysterious than previous generations believed. The fact that someone like Defoe could systematically investigate a natural disaster, collect data, and produce a comprehensive account. This represents a new way of understanding the world, not through divine revelation or ancient authority, but through observation, documentation, and analysis. Defoe's The Storm, published in 1704, becomes a bestseller and remains in print for decades. It's part disaster account, part investigation, and part meditation on human vulnerability in the face of nature. But more importantly, it's proof that complex natural phenomena can be studied systematically and understood rationally. This approach will influence everything from how future disasters are documented to how scientific investigation is conducted. The insurance industry, forced to reinvent itself after the storm's financial devastation, becomes more sophisticated and more mathematical in its approach. The disaster accelerates the development of actuarial science and risk assessment. In a very real way, the modern insurance industry, with its complex calculations of risk and probability, has roots in the attempts to understand and price the risk of another great storm. Weather observation becomes more systematic in the storm's aftermath. More people invest in barometers, detailed weather logs are kept, and patterns are noted. The Royal Society encourages this systematic observation, collecting data that will eventually contribute to the development of meteorology as a proper science. It will take another century and a half before weather forecasting becomes reliable, but the Great Storm marks an important step in that direction. The religious response to the storm also has lasting effects, though perhaps not the ones the clergy intended. While sermons frame the disaster as divine judgment, the fact that the godly and ungodly suffered equally raises uncomfortable questions. Why would God destroy churches while sparing taverns? Why kill pious sailors while sparing sinful merchants? These questions don't shake religious faith. England remains deeply Christian, but they contribute to a gradually developing sense that maybe natural events have natural causes rather than being direct expressions of divine will. This is part of a larger intellectual shift happening across Europe, the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, observation, and natural law. The Great Storm doesn't cause this shift, but it provides dramatic evidence that supports the new way of thinking. If even the weather follows natural laws rather than being directly controlled by divine intervention, then perhaps the entire universe operates according to predictable principles that humans can discover and understand. In literature and culture, the storm becomes a symbol of nature's power and human vulnerability. It appears in poems, plays, and novels. Artists depict the devastation in engravings and paintings, the image of ships being torn apart in harbour, of ancient trees toppling, of churches losing their steeples. These become powerful metaphors for the fragility of human achievements in the face of natural forces. The storm also influences British maritime culture and the national self-image. Britain sees itself as a naval power, as a nation connected to the sea. The fact that the sea could strike so devastating a blow right in the heart of British naval strength is sobering. It reinforces the respect for the ocean that is central to British maritime tradition. The understanding that the sea is never fully tamed, never completely safe, and always demands respect. For the families who lost loved ones in the storm, the legacy is more personal and more painful. Approximately 8,000 people died, most of them sailors who drowned when their ships went down. That's a staggering number for a country with England's population in 1703. Nearly every coastal community lost someone. Every port town has widows and orphans. The human cost ripples through society for a generation. There's also an economic legacy. The destruction of property, the loss of ships and cargo, and the cost of reconstruction, all of this represents an enormous financial burden. England in 1703 is already fighting an expensive war with France. Adding a massive natural disaster on top of that strains the national economy. Taxes are raised to fund reconstruction of government buildings and churches. Insurance premiums skyrocket. Some businesses never recover. But there's also resilience in the response. Communities come together to rebuild. Neighbours help neighbours clear debris and repair homes. The nation as a whole demonstrates a capacity to absorb a devastating blow and keep functioning. This resilience becomes part of Britain's national character, part of the story the country tells about itself, that British people endure, persist and carry on regardless of circumstances. The Great Storm becomes part of the cultural mythology that helps define what it means to be British. It's invoked during World War II when the Blitz is compared to natural disasters of the past. It's referenced during subsequent hurricanes and floods. It becomes one of those foundational stories that help a nation understand itself, a reminder that Britain has faced catastrophe before and survived. From a modern perspective, knowing what we now know about climate and weather systems, the Great Storm of 1703 remains meteorologically fascinating. Computer models attempting to recreate the storm based on historical accounts suggest it was essentially a bomb cyclone, an extratropical storm that underwent explosive intensification, with pressure dropping at unprecedented rates. These storms are rare but not impossible, and when they occur in the North Atlantic, they can produce conditions similar to major hurricanes. What makes the 1703 storm exceptional is that it struck at peak intensity, maintained that intensity for many hours, and hit the most populated and developed part of England directly. It was a perfect storm in the literal sense, the perfect combination of meteorological conditions, timing and geography to produce maximum devastation. Modern climate science can't say with certainty whether the storm was a pure anomaly or whether it reflected broader climate patterns. The early 1700s fall within what's called the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler than average temperatures in Europe. Some climate historians speculate that the unusual temperature patterns of this period might have contributed to unusual storm patterns, but the evidence is inconclusive. What we can say is that storms of similar intensity are possible today. The technology and infrastructure of modern Britain are better equipped to handle extreme weather than the wooden buildings and sailing ships of 1703. But a storm of truly equivalent intensity, sustained winds of 120 plus miles per hour striking southern England, would still cause catastrophic damage despite all our modern advantages. As you settle deeper into your blanket and the story winds toward its end, it's worth reflecting on what the Great Storm of 1703 can teach us more than 3 centuries later. Because while the specifics are historical, the themes are eternal. Nature's power, human vulnerability, resilience in the face of disaster, and the ongoing challenge of understanding forces beyond our control. The people of 1703 lived in a world that was in many ways utterly different from ours. They travelled by horse and sailing ship, lit their homes with candles, and had no electricity, no engines, and no synthetic materials of any kind. Their entire technological civilization was based on wood, stone, metal, and muscle power, human and animal. Yet their emotional responses to the storm would be immediately recognizable to anyone who has lived through a natural disaster. The fear as the winds intensified, the uncertainty about whether shelter would hold, the shock of seeing familiar landscapes transformed into unrecognizable devastation, the grief of loss, the overwhelm of recovery, and the gradual emergence of resilience and determination to rebuild. These human experiences transcend technology and time. The storm also reminds us that nature operates on scales, and with forces that dwarf human power. For all our modern technology, our reinforced buildings, our weather satellites, our computer models, we remain fundamentally vulnerable to natural forces. We've gotten better at predicting disasters and surviving them, but we haven't eliminated the vulnerability. A storm strong enough can still overwhelm our preparations. This isn't a depressing thought, or at least it doesn't have to be. There's something almost comforting about the reminder that humans aren't in complete control, that there are forces in the world larger than our politics, our economies, and our personal concerns. The wind that blew through England in 1703 didn't care about national boundaries, religious differences, social class, or individual achievement. It treated everyone equally, which in its way was a form of justice. The Great Storm also demonstrates the importance of systematic observation and record keeping. Without Daniel Defoe's investigation, Without the detailed accounts he collected, our understanding of the storm would be much more limited. We'd have scattered references in letters and diaries, but not the comprehensive picture that Defoe's work provides. This has relevance for how we approach modern challenges. Climate change, for instance, requires exactly this kind of systematic, long-term observation and documentation. We need people willing to do the patient, unglamorous work of collecting data, comparing accounts, and building comprehensive records. Defoe's work in 1703 was pioneering in this regard. He essentially invented disaster journalism and established a model for investigating natural catastrophes that we still use today. The storm also illustrates how disasters can accelerate change. The architectural improvements, the advances in maritime safety, the development of insurance practices, and the progress in weather observation. All of these might have happened eventually, but the storm compressed years or decades of gradual development into a few months of urgent necessity. Sometimes it takes a crisis to overcome inertia and implement improvements that people had been discussing but not acting on. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Great Fire of London in 1666 led to improved building codes and the first organised firefighting services. The Titanic sinking in 1912 revolutionised maritime safety regulations. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 transformed emergency management planning. Disasters, for all their tragedy, can be powerful catalysts for positive change, assuming we're willing to learn from them. The religious responses to the storm are also instructive, not because they were correct in their attribution of divine judgment, but because they show how people seek meaning in natural disasters. Humans seem psychologically wired to find patterns and purposes even in random or probabilistic events. When something terrible happens, saying, "It's just bad luck," or "It's a statistical inevitability," doesn't provide the same psychological comfort as finding meaning in the event. Modern secular society has largely replaced religious interpretations with scientific ones, but the underlying need to understand and contextualize disaster remains. We explain hurricanes in terms of sea surface temperatures and atmospheric pressure gradients, which is more accurate than explaining them as divine judgment. But the psychological function is similar, to make the incomprehensible comprehensible, and to restore a sense of order and understanding to chaotic events. The storm also reminds us about the power of community in recovery. The immediate aftermath saw people helping each other, sharing resources, and working together to clear debris and repair damage. This spontaneous cooperation wasn't organised by government or mandated by authority. It emerged naturally from people recognising their mutual vulnerability and mutual dependence. This pattern appears in virtually every disaster, ancient or modern. When catastrophe strips away the normal social structures and economic systems, people tend to cooperate rather than compete. The popular image of disaster survivors descending into chaos and violence is largely myth. The reality is usually mutual aid and solidarity. The Great Storm of 1703 demonstrated this, and every disaster since has confirmed it. There's something deeply optimistic in this pattern. It suggests that beneath all our divisions and differences, humans retain a fundamental capacity for empathy and cooperation. When things are really bad, when survival is uncertain and the normal rules don't apply, people tend to help each other. This capacity for mutual aid might be one of humanity's most important survival traits. The storm's legacy also includes all the stories that have been passed down through generations. The grandmother who survived by hiding in a stone cellar, the sailor who was washed overboard but managed to grab floating debris and was rescued at dawn, the village that lost its church but rebuilt it stronger. These stories become part of family histories, local traditions, and the narrative fabric of communities. These oral histories serve important functions. They preserve memory, they transmit lessons, and they connect generations. They remind people that their ancestors faced catastrophes and survived, which provides perspective during current difficulties. When your own world feels like it's falling apart, Knowing that your great-great-great-grandparents survived the Great Storm of 1703 can be genuinely comforting. As weather patterns become more extreme due to climate change, the Great Storm takes on new relevance as a historical benchmark. It reminds us that even without human-caused climate change, nature is capable of producing extreme events. It provides a calibration point. If storms like this were possible in the Little Ice Age, what might be possible in a warming world? This isn't to minimise climate change or suggest that extreme weather is nothing new. Rather, it's to acknowledge that we're not starting from a baseline of calm, predictable weather. Earth's climate has always produced extremes, and human civilization has always had to contend with nature's capacity for violence. Climate change is making this worse, potentially much worse, but the underlying vulnerability was always there. The Great Storm of 1703 stands as a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. It showed how quickly the comfortable, familiar world can be torn apart by natural forces. But it also showed how people respond, with courage, with mutual aid, and with determination to understand what happened and to rebuild better than before. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the wind that blew through England on that November night in 1703. It started as disturbances in the atmosphere over the Atlantic, subtle differences in temperature and pressure that gradually amplified into something monstrous. It travelled thousands of miles across the ocean, gathering strength until it struck a small island with unprecedented fury. The wind itself was just air in motion, molecules responding to physical laws with no consciousness or intent. Yet the people who experienced it described it in almost personal terms, as if the wind had will, had purpose, had rage. This is how humans make sense of forces beyond our control, by anthropomorphizing them, by creating narratives that turn natural processes into stories we can understand. That wind is gone now, its energy long since dissipated, its molecules scattered across the atmosphere and cycled through countless other weather systems over the past 3 centuries. But its effects ripple forward through time. The buildings that were redesigned because of it still stand, incorporating lessons learned on that terrible night. The maritime safety procedures it inspired still protect sailors. The systematic approach to disaster investigation that Defoe pioneered still guides how we respond to catastrophes. The people who experienced the storm are gone too, of course. The last survivor died sometime in the late 1700s, and with them died the immediate memory of that night. But they left records, stories, and descriptions that allow us to reconstruct their experience. Daniel Defoe's investigation preserved hundreds of accounts that would otherwise have been lost. Parish records documented the deaths. Insurance claims recorded the property damage. Letters and diaries captured personal reactions. These records allow us to touch, across 3 centuries, the experience of people who face something overwhelming and terrifying. We can read their words, follow their logic, and share their fear and grief and eventual determination. History isn't just dates and facts, it's the accumulated experience of countless individuals, preserved in fragments that we can piece together into something like understanding. If you visited southern England today, you could still find traces of the Great Storm if you knew where to look. There are ancient trees whose trunks show damage from 1703 and limbs that were torn away and never quite grew back properly. There are buildings that incorporate salvaged timbers from structures destroyed in the storm. There are graveyards where unusual clusters of burials from November and December 1703 tell silent stories of loss. The storm has become part of the landscape's deep history, part of the accumulated memory that makes a place what it is. Every location has these layers, events that shaped the land and the people, that influenced how communities developed, that left marks both physical and cultural that persist long after the events themselves have faded from living memory. And somewhere in the Atlantic right now, air is moving, pressure systems are forming, and weather is being made. The same physical processes that created the Great Storm of 1703 are still operating. The same equations govern how storms form and intensify. The same ocean that bred that ancient tempest still breeds modern ones, and still occasionally produces conditions that create extraordinary violence. We're better prepared now than people were in 1703. We have warning systems, sturdy buildings, and weather forecasts that can predict storms days in advance. But we're not invulnerable. Nature still has the capacity to surprise us, to produce events at the edge of probability that exceed our preparations and assumptions. This is both sobering and, in a strange way, exciting. It means the world retains its capacity to astonish us, to remind us that for all our knowledge and technology, we remain part of natural systems that operate on scales beyond our control. We're passengers on a planet spinning through space, protected by a thin layer of atmosphere that sometimes moves in ways that can tear our civilization apart. But we're passengers with memory, with records, with the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced disasters and learned from them. The great storm of 1703 is part of that accumulated wisdom, a reminder of what's possible, a lesson in vulnerability and resilience, and a story that connects us to people long dead who faced their darkest night with whatever courage they could muster. As you sleep tonight, safe in a building that incorporates 3 centuries of improved understanding of wind resistance and structural engineering, you're benefiting from lessons that were purchased with great suffering in 1703. Every secure roof beam, every well-anchored foundation, every building code and safety regulation, they all rest on the accumulated experience of people who faced disasters and said, "Never again, or at least not like this." Sleep well, knowing that you're part of this ongoing human story of learning from catastrophe, of building better after disaster, of facing an indifferent universe with determination and ingenuity. The wind that blew in 1703 is gone, but the lessons it taught remain, woven into the fabric of how we build, how we prepare, and how we understand our place in the natural world. And tomorrow, when you check the weather forecast, a routine action that would have seemed like magic to someone in 1703, remember that you're benefiting from centuries of careful observation that began in part with people trying to understand the incomprehensible storm that struck on a November night 300 years ago. The great storm of 1703 is over, but its legacy continues. It lives in our buildings, our institutions, our scientific understanding, and our cultural memory. It reminds us that history isn't just about kings and wars and political events. It's also about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, about human vulnerability and resilience, and about the ongoing conversation between human civilization and the natural forces that shaped the planet long before we arrived, and will continue long after we're gone. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be as peaceful as that November night was violent. The storm has passed, the wind has settled, and morning always comes, even after the longest, darkest night.